Saint Luke the Younger spent his life pursuing solitude, discipline, and spiritual purity. He moved through the harsh landscapes of central Greece, not in search of comfort, but in search of a life stripped of distraction. His reputation slowly spread beyond the mountains until even senior churchmen had heard of the hermit who had chosen poverty over all earthly gain. One day, word reached him that the Metropolitan of Corinth was passing nearby on his way to Constantinople. Luke did not go to meet him in hope of reward or patronage. He came carrying the best produce he had grown with his own hands, simple offerings from his garden, given with sincerity. These were modest gifts, yet they revealed something important about him. Even in poverty, he wished to give rather than receive. When the Metropolitan learned who Luke was, where he lived, and what kind of discipline guided his life, he chose to visit the hermit's dwelling himself. This was no grand residence, only a poor shelter shaped by hardship and prayer. Yet what he found there impressed him far more than wealth or ceremony ever could. He saw a man who had embraced deprivation willingly, not as punishment, but as a path towards spiritual freedom. Moved by what he witnessed, the Metropolitan decided to offer him money, believing it might ease the burdens of such a life. Luke refused at once. He explained that he had not come looking for gold, but for guidance. Money meant little to someone who had already abandoned the world's usual ambitions. What he truly desired was instruction on salvation. At first, the bishop took this rejection personally. He feared the refusal was not directed at the gift itself, but at the giver. In his eyes, the acceptance of charity was bound up with humility, fellowship, and the Christian duty of allowing others to perform good works. He argued that if Luke had no use for the gift, he could still pass it on to someone else in need. To dismiss it entirely seemed, from his perspective, to dismiss an opportunity for mercy. Luke understood the distress this caused and decided not to deepen it. He accepted only a single coin, enough to honour the bishop's intention without betraying his own principles. Then, having settled that matter, he turned to the question that truly concerned him. He asked how a solitary living far from churches and priests might take part in the sacred mysteries. This was the real issue weighing on him. A life of isolation brought him closer to silence and prayer, but it also placed him at a distance from the ordinary rhythm of communal worship. The Metropolitan answered carefully. Ideally, a priest should be present, but if no priest could be found, then Luke was to place sanctified bread, already consecrated elsewhere, on a clean surface. If he was in a chapel, he should use the holy table. If he was in a simple cell, then a carefully prepared bench would suffice. He was to cover the holy gifts with a cloth, light incense, recite the proper prayers, bow repeatedly in reverence, and then receive the body of Christ. In place of consecrated wine, he was instructed to drink ordinary wine separately and with solemn restraint. Any remaining portions were to be handled with great care, protected from dishonour or accident. These instructions reveal what mattered most in that spiritual world. Purity of place, ordered gestures, prayer, bodily reverence, and the careful handling of holy things were all treated as essential. The rite was not casual, even in isolation. It required preparation, humility, and disciplined attention. Luke's purpose was not to invent his own form of worship, but to preserve communion with the sacred life of the Church even while living apart from society. He was seeking more than comfort for his soul. He was trying to unite the solitary life with liturgical devotion, to make sure that withdrawal from the world did not become separation from grace. In that effort, his austerity was balanced by obedience, and his longing for the divine remained tied to ritual order. Another holy figure, very different in setting and temperament, appeared farther north in the lands of Central Europe. Adalbert of Prague came from a powerful family in Bohemia and received an education that tied him to the intellectual and religious life of the empire. Though he became a bishop, his life was marked by movement, struggle, and a constant tension between office and personal calling. In time, he turned away from the burdens of political conflict and chose missionary work among the pagan peoples living near the Baltic. His final journey led him toward Prussia, where he hoped to preach Christianity in a region still governed by its own customs, beliefs, and sacred traditions. Before entering that dangerous territory, Adalbert passed through a border city, where his arrival brought visible success. Crowds gathered, baptisms took place, and he celebrated the Mass. Yet even in that moment of achievement, the narrative casts a shadow of coming death. The bread remaining from the liturgy was carefully wrapped and kept for the journey ahead, as though what had just been celebrated among converts would soon sustain a man walking toward martyrdom. From there he continued on with only a priest and his brother at his side. The armed escort that had accompanied him on part of the route withdrew, leaving the small group exposed in a hostile land. Their first encounters with the local population revealed the limits of missionary confidence. The newcomers were driven off, with blows and insults. Adalbert himself was struck so hard that he fell to the ground, his book scattered from his hands. Yet he did not answer with anger. Instead, he received the violence as a sign that he had been allowed to suffer, even in a small way, for Christ. This reaction defines his entire final mission. He interpreted opposition not as failure, but as participation in something sacred. When questioned, he introduced himself plainly. He said he was a Slav by birth, a monk by vocation, once a bishop in rank, and now an apostle to them. His purpose, he declared, was their salvation. He wanted them to abandon idols, recognize the one God, and gain eternal life. The people he addressed did not hear this as a message of hope. To them, he was a foreign religious intruder who threatened the foundations of their world. Their law was not his law. Their customs were not his customs. They warned him clearly that he could not remain. The text presents them as fierce, united, and protective of a shared order. This was not random violence. It was a collective defense of territory, belief, and way of life. The account also suggests a recognizable social structure among them. There were local leaders, guardians of boundaries, and priests attached to the old religion. The community spoke as one body, bound by common rules, suspicious of strangers, and prepared to use force against those who challenged its customs. Even after being expelled once, Adalbert did not abandon the mission. Days later, he and his companions continued on foot, praying as they travelled. At midday, they stopped. Mass was celebrated. He received communion, ate only enough to sustain the journey, and rested briefly. It was then that armed men rushed upon them, seized them, and put them in chains. Adalbert urged his companions not to lose heart. Suffering, he reminded them, was being endured for the name of the Lord. In his final moments, he spoke not of fear, revenge, or disappointment, but of love. Nothing, in his view, was greater than offering a worthy life for Christ. The man who dealt the fatal blow is described as a priest of the local idols, the leader of the attacking group. That detail is important. According to the story, Adalbert was not killed by random bandits or an undisciplined mob, but by men acting in defense of their religious order. The first spear pierced him deeply, and others followed, adding wound after wound. Even then, the saint is shown praying for both himself and those killing him. His attitude toward his assassins remained one of pity and forgiveness. He saw them as persecutors, but not as enemies beyond redemption. His biographer, however, speaks of them in much harsher language, describing them as savage, godless, and consumed by fury. Here the difference is striking. Adalbert's own posture is compassionate and imitative of Christ. The narrator's tone is condemning, shaped by the desire to exalt martyrdom through the brutality of those who caused it. The story of St. Stephen of Hungary moves into yet another world, one where sanctity is tied not to the desert or the mission field, but to kingship itself. Stephen was born into the ruling house of a land in transformation. Christianity was still fragile there, not yet firmly rooted, and the task before him was not only to govern, but to build an entire Christian order. From an early age, his life was framed as chosen and guided by divine purpose. He was baptized by Adalbert of Prague, given a name associated with kingship and heavenly reward, and raised with the expectation that he would rule. When power passed to him, Stephen faced opposition almost at once. In one telling of his life, his enemies are the pagan forces within his own realm, nobles and communities unwilling to accept the spread of Christianity. He is portrayed as a ruler who combines political authority with holy purpose. He secures peace abroad so that he can strengthen the new faith at home. He defeats those who resist him and presses them toward baptism. In this image, he is not remembered primarily as a conqueror for personal glory, but as a Christian ruler fighting for the spiritual transformation of his people. He founds bishoprics, supports monasteries, builds churches, and organizes the kingdom into dioceses. His rule appears as structured, deliberate, and inseparable from ecclesiastical order. This portrayal also places special emphasis on holy protection. Stephen's victories are linked to the cross, to revered saints, and most clearly to the Virgin Mary. She is not a secondary detail in this version of his story. She stands near the centre of his kingship. The kingdom, the ruler, and the Christian future of the land are all connected to her protection. That bond gives his reign a sacred dimension that goes beyond ordinary politics. He is not merely a king who supports Christianity. He is a ruler whose authority is framed as sheltered and strengthened by heavenly intercession. A different portrait emerges in another account of his life. Here, Stephen appears sterner, more severe, and more concerned with justice in its harshest form. In this version, his enemies are not pagan rebels, but criminals within the realm, especially violent robbers who attack foreign merchants. When the victims come before him and describe what has happened, he does not respond with theatrical rage. Instead, he acts with measured determination. He orders the guilty to be found, questioned, and punished. Their sentence is public and brutal. They are hanged in pairs along the roads, so that all may see what becomes of those who violate law and mercy. The intention is unmistakable. Fear is used to establish order. This harsher image does not weaken the argument for Stephen's sanctity in that account. Instead, holiness is demonstrated in another way. He is shown as a ruler whose justice protects the innocent, restrains evil, and imposes moral order on society. After his death, this sanctity is confirmed not by gentle description alone, but by miracles. His body, buried in the church he had built, becomes a source of healing. The sick gather, the blind recover sight, the lame walk, and those suffering from many forms of illness are restored. When the time comes to recognize him officially as a saint, fasting, prayer, and solemn ritual surround the opening of his tomb. A powerful fragrance rises and miraculous cures follow. In this way, the case for his holiness is made visible and public. His sanctity is not only asserted through memory, it is revealed through wonders associated with his remains. The two portraits of Stephen preserve two different ideals of rulership. One wants him remembered as the founder of Christian Hungary, the ruler who subdued resistance, established the church, and placed his kingdom beneath divine care. The other presents him as the stern guardian of justice whose sanctity was confirmed after death through unmistakable miracles. Both agree that he was a holy king, but each shapes that holiness differently. One emphasizes mission, institution, and sacred kingship. The other stresses judgment, discipline, and signs from heaven. The role of the Virgin Mary also differs between the two. In the fuller and more expansive portrayal, her presence is strong and unmistakable. Stephen's reign is closely tied to her protection, and the connection between the king, his kingdom, and the Mother of God is made with real force. In the shorter and harsher account, that connection is much less central. The church in which he is buried is dedicated to her, but she does not dominate the narrative in the same way. The stronger Marian vision belongs clearly to the account that presents Stephen as the architect of a Christian realm under heavenly guardianship. The memory of St. Clement stretches across generations, shaped by faith, storytelling, and rediscovery. He was remembered as one of the early leaders of the Christian community in Rome, closely associated with St. Peter. His story became more powerful after his exile under Emperor Trajan, when he was sent far from the center of the empire to the distant shores of the Black Sea. Even there, far from Rome, he continued to preach, drawing people toward Christianity and inspiring the formation of new communities. His death was dramatic and symbolic. He was thrown into the sea with an anchor tied to his body, an image that would define how later generations remembered him. For a time, his presence remained alive in the region of Cherson, but over the years his burial place was forgotten and only fragments of tradition survived. Centuries later, the figure of Constantine Cyril entered this story. Travelling through the region with his brother Methodius, he turned his attention to the lost memory of Clement. What began as a diplomatic journey quickly became a mission of recovery. Constantine did not act passively. He gathered local clergy, officials, and believers, turning the search into a collective effort shaped by prayer and determination. The process was slow. Days passed without clear results, yet the effort itself took on a sacred meaning. It was no longer just a search for bones, but a test of faith and endurance. One winter day, the search moved forward with renewed purpose. A group set out by boat, chanting as they crossed the water toward an island believed to hold the remains. The journey itself seemed filled with signs. Sudden rain clouds gathered and then disappeared. Darkness gave way to clear moonlight. Those present interpreted these moments as indications that their task had divine support. When they reached the site, the discovery did not come all at once. It unfolded piece by piece. A fragment appeared, then another, until the full remains of the saint began to emerge. The moment when the skull was revealed left a deep impression on those present. It was described as radiant, almost overwhelming, filling the group with a mixture of awe and emotion. Constantine played a decisive role in shaping how this event was understood. He was not simply part of the search. He directed it, gave it meaning, and later recorded it in a way that emphasized its spiritual significance. By doing so, he ensured that the discovery would not remain a local event. Instead, it became something larger, a moment that connected different Christian communities across regions. By carrying parts of the relics from place to place, he extended their importance far beyond Cherson, creating a network of shared devotion. When the relics were brought back to the city, the reaction was immediate and intense. People gathered from all walks of life. The remains were received with processions, prayers, and songs that continued late into the night. Candles lit the streets, and the entire city seemed to move together in a single act of celebration. Social divisions disappeared in the moment. Wealth and status no longer mattered. Everyone took part in the same expression of reverence. The relics were carried through the streets and into the main church, where the sense of unity reached its height. For the people of Cherson, this was not just a religious event. It was a moment of renewal, a way of reconnecting with a past that had nearly been lost. This enthusiasm was rooted in a strong belief that relics held real power. They were seen as sources of healing and protection, capable of influencing both individuals and the wider community. In a world shaped by uncertainty, such a discovery offered reassurance. It created a direct connection between the visible world and the divine. This explains why the event was remembered with such intensity. It was not only about recovering physical remains, but about restoring a living bond with the sacred. At the same time, not everyone accepted this way of thinking. A movement known as the Bogomils emerged in the region, offering a very different understanding of the world. They believed that the material world was not created by God, but by a rebellious spiritual force. In their view, everything physical was part of a flawed and deceptive system. Because of this, they rejected many elements of traditional Christian practice, including churches, icons, and relics. What others saw as sacred, they saw as misleading. Their ideas also challenged social structures. They criticized wealth and authority, arguing that those who held power were tied to corruption. They encouraged their followers to distance themselves from established systems and to reject obedience to rulers. This made them appear threatening to both religious and political authorities. Yet their outward behavior often seemed humble and disciplined, which made their beliefs less immediately obvious. Church leaders responded strongly against them, describing them as dangerous and deceptive. They accused them of denying essential elements of Christian belief and undermining the unity of the community. The contrast between these two perspectives reveals a deeper tension. On one side stood traditions built on shared rituals and sacred objects. On the other side were ideas that rejected those foundations and offered an entirely different vision of reality. While these debates unfolded, another powerful figure moved through the Byzantine world, shaping communities in a different way. Saint Nikon, known for his constant call to repentance, lived a life that combined strict discipline with active engagement in society. Born into a wealthy background in Asia Minor, he chose a path of religious dedication that led him across Crete and later into mainland Greece. He was not a distant hermit. He moved among people, preaching, correcting, and guiding them with remarkable energy. His physical endurance became part of his reputation. He travelled long distances on foot, often under harsh conditions, without appearing to weaken. His voice carried over crowds, even overpowering the noise of public gatherings. He did not hesitate to confront wrongdoing, whether it came from criminals or from those he believed were influenced by darker forces. At the same time, he acted as a mediator within communities, taking on responsibilities that required both authority and compassion. During the construction of a church in Sparta, stories of his actions began to circulate widely. At one point, workers encountered a massive stone that could not be moved, despite the efforts of many. When Nikon approached and touched it, the stone was lifted with ease. The event was seen as a sign of divine support. As construction continued, those involved claimed that harmful forces were driven away, and that injuries were healed through prayer alone. Another story described a shortage of wine among the workers. What remained had spoiled and was nearly undrinkable. Nikon prayed over it, and the liquid was said to have changed, becoming fresh and pleasant. For those present, this was not just a practical solution, but a confirmation of divine intervention. The building process itself was seen as guided by something beyond human effort. Materials seemed to appear when needed, and progress advanced more quickly than expected. One of the most striking episodes involved Nikon testing the loyalty of the community. With no money to pay the workers, he proposed allowing himself to be treated as a slave, to be led through the city in chains. The people understood his intention and responded by covering the cost themselves. The chain used in this act later became an object of reverence. It was believed to carry healing power, capable of curing illness and driving away harmful spirits. Preserved in a sacred space, it became a symbol of both humility and divine grace. These stories reveal much about the beliefs of the people who told them. Miracles were not seen as distant or abstract. They were expected to appear in everyday life, especially in connection with holy individuals. Objects associated with such figures were believed to carry lasting power. The success of Nikon's work can be understood in this context. He combined personal discipline, visible action, and strong communication, creating a presence that people could both see and feel. In another part of Europe, a very different kind of spiritual life was taking shape. Athanasios, who founded a major monastic community on Mount Athos, focused not on miracles, but on structure and discipline. His vision was of a community where monks lived together under clear rules, sharing work, prayer, and daily routines. This was a shift away from complete solitude toward a more organized form of religious life. The daily schedule was carefully arranged. Prayer was frequent and physically demanding, involving repeated acts of prostration. Meals followed strict patterns, with readings taking place as the monks ate. Silence, order, and obedience were emphasized at every stage. Roles were assigned within the community to maintain discipline. Some ensured that others attended services on time, while others monitored behavior throughout the day and night. Personal property was not allowed. Everything belonged to the community, and even the smallest possessions required approval. This rule reinforced the idea that monastic life required complete detachment from individual ownership. At the same time, practical needs were not ignored. Diet was described in detail, with adjustments made for workers and those who were ill. Physical labor was an important part of the system, and those engaged in demanding tasks were given additional support. Sound played a key role in this environment. Bells and wooden instruments signaled when to gather, when to eat, and when to pray. These sounds structured the day, creating a rhythm that guided every action. The system was designed to remove uncertainty and replace it with order, ensuring that each member of the community remained focused on spiritual goals. In the later 11th century, a powerful figure emerged in the Byzantine world, whose life combined military authority, political influence, and religious ambition. Gregory Pakurianos rose through the ranks during a time of instability and external threat, serving emperors and commanding armies in the Balkans. His success on the battlefield brought him wealth, land, and status. Yet rather than simply consolidating power, he turned his attention towards something more enduring. In the mountainous region near Philippopolis, he established a monastery dedicated to the Mother of God, shaping it not only as a spiritual center but also as a carefully structured institution designed to survive beyond his lifetime. The foundation was not an isolated act of piety. It was supported by extensive estates spread across different regions. These lands included villages, fortifications, pastures, vineyards, and agricultural fields. They were not symbolic donations, but functioning economic units meant to sustain the monastery's daily life. The inclusion of forts is particularly revealing. These were not given for military expansion, but for protection and administration. In a region exposed to raids and instability, control over fortified sites ensured both security and continuity. The monastery thus became part of a wider landscape of defense, economy, and settlement, linking spiritual life with practical realities. Pakurianos also insisted on strict independence for his foundation. He did not want it to fall under the authority of imperial officials, local bishops, or other external powers. This decision reflects both caution and experience. Having spent much of his life navigating political rivalries and shifting alliances, he understood how easily institutions could be influenced or controlled. By securing autonomy, he aimed to protect the monastery from corruption, interference, or doctrinal pressure. At the same time, he placed limits on who could join the community. The monks were to share a common linguistic and cultural background, reinforcing internal cohesion and identity. The monastery was also designed as a place of learning. Provision was made for the education of young boys, who would be trained until they were ready for religious service. This emphasis on instruction shows that the foundation was not only meant to preserve faith, but also to reproduce it. Knowledge, language, and ritual practice were to be passed on within a controlled environment. To support this system, Pakurianos established an annual gathering near the monastery where goods could be exchanged. This ensured that the community remained economically viable without becoming isolated from the surrounding world. The inventory of what he donated reveals another important aspect of medieval religious culture. Alongside land and buildings, he listed objects of great value: icons, liturgical books, vessels, garments, and relics. These were not simply decorative. They were central to the functioning of the church. Icons served as visual expressions of faith. Books preserved sacred texts and guided worship. Precious vessels were used in rituals that connected the community to the divine. Their value was both material and symbolic, reflecting the belief that beauty, craftsmanship, and devotion were inseparable. References to conflicts with steppe peoples such as the Pechenegs and the Cumans appear within this context as well. These mentions are not random. They underline the instability of the region and the challenges faced by those living there. At the same time, they highlight the role of divine protection in victory. Military success is presented not only as a result of strategy, but as a sign of favour. By including these details, Pakurianos linked his personal achievements to a larger narrative in which faith and power were intertwined. While such institutional developments were taking place, other sources from the same broad region offer a different perspective on everyday life. Within Jewish communities in East Central Europe, legal disputes and practical concerns reveal a world shaped by trade, mobility, and negotiation. Merchants travel between regions, forming partnerships and agreements that could easily lead to conflict. Questions of profit, trust, and obligation were brought before religious authorities, who acted as judges and interpreters of the law. These cases show how economic life depended not only on opportunity, but also on systems of accountability. The presence of slavery and captivity also appears in these accounts. In times of conflict, individuals could be taken, sold, or separated from their families. Stories of children lost and later rediscovered reflect the instability of the period. At the same time, they reveal the role of networks that extended across regions, linking communities through shared language, religion, and legal practice. Even in difficult circumstances, there were efforts to maintain identity and continuity. Religious life within these communities was closely regulated. Questions about proper conduct, ritual practice, and conversion show a concern with maintaining boundaries. When individuals from different traditions sought to join the community, specific procedures were followed to ensure that the transition was complete and meaningful. Observance was not casual. It required preparation, discipline, and adherence to established forms. A different kind of religious instruction can be seen in texts designed for teaching basic beliefs. These works present knowledge in the form of short questions and answers, making them easy to remember and repeat. Their explanations often differ from formal doctrine, blending accepted ideas with imaginative interpretations. Creation, the nature of the world, and the origins of language are described in ways that reflect both curiosity and a desire to make complex ideas accessible. The presence of such material suggests that education was not limited to formal settings, but could also take place through memorization and discussion. At the same time, official religious authorities continue to address practical concerns in everyday life. In one collection of questions posed to a bishop, topics range from ritual practice to moral behavior. Instructions are given for how to receive converts, how to deal with lingering pagan customs, and how to regulate relationships within the community. The answers reveal a balance between strictness and flexibility. Some practices are strongly condemned, especially those linked to older beliefs. Others are treated with a degree of tolerance, reflecting the realities of social life. These different strands, monastic foundations, legal disputes, instructional texts, and pastoral guidance, together create a detailed picture of medieval society. Religion was not confined to isolated spaces. It shaped institutions, influenced economic activity, guided education, and regulated personal behavior. Leaders like Gregory Pakurianos sought to build lasting structures that would preserve faith and order. At the same time, ordinary people navigated a world of trade, conflict, and cultural exchange, relying on religious frameworks to make sense of their experiences. In the second half of the 11th century, the political and religious life of Poland became deeply entangled in a conflict that later generations would remember not simply as a personal clash, but as a defining struggle over power, conscience, and the place of the Church within the kingdom. Bolesław the Bold continued the policies of his father, supporting monasteries and strengthening ecclesiastical institutions. And in that atmosphere, he elevated Stanisław, a young cleric from a noble military family, to the bishopric of Kraków. At first, this rise must have seemed like a sign of harmony between ruler and bishop. Yet the relationship gradually hardened into hostility. As later tradition tells it, Stanisław did not remain silent before royal misconduct. He confronted the king over injustice, violence, and the burden placed on ordinary people. He condemned the abuse of authority, the oppression of the weak, and the habit of treating the property and labour of subjects as though they existed only for the pleasure of the court. This moral resistance did not remain abstract. The bishop increasingly avoided the king's circle, distancing himself from royal councils and refusing to appear as if he approved of policies he judged corrupt. Instead, he devoted himself more fully to worship, prayer, and the care of his flock, turning the church into both a spiritual refuge and a silent rebuke to secular power. One episode became central to his later legend. Seeking to increase the resources of the church in Kraków, Stanisław had purchased a village on the Vistula from a nobleman named Peter, paying the proper sum in silver. For years the church held the village without open dispute, but after Peter's death, his relatives saw an opportunity. Knowing that the king already bore resentment toward the bishop, they challenged the transaction and demanded the property back. The case was brought before the royal court. There, in a setting already poisoned by political malice, the bishop was told that unless he could produce the seller himself, a written contract or reliable witnesses, he would lose the land. He read out the names of witnesses, but fear of the king kept them from appearing. With human support collapsing around him, the bishop asked for 3 more days and made an astonishing promise. He would bring back the man who had sold the estate. To many, the request sounded absurd. Yet after the delay was granted, he celebrated Mass in the village church, went in full vestments to Peter's grave, and prayed for God to restore the dead man long enough to speak the truth. In the story that followed, the tomb was opened. Peter rose, and the bishop led him into the assembly, where the dead man confirmed the sale before king and nobles. This miracle was meant to show not only the sanctity of Stanisław, but also the bankruptcy of earthly justice when it becomes dependent on fear. The conflict did not end there. The bishop continued to oppose the king, and when correction failed, he moved from rebuke to formal condemnation. He is said to have placed the king under anathema and forbidden him to enter the church. That act transformed a moral quarrel into an open breach. The king, already enraged, now appears in the narrative as a ruler overcome by fury, no longer restrained by dignity, ritual, or fear of divine judgment. while Stanislaw was celebrating the liturgy in the Church of St. Michael on the Skałka, the king ordered his men to seize him from the altar. But the story insists that those sent to arrest the bishop were unable to complete the act. Again and again they fell back, as though struck down by the weight of what they were trying to do. Their fear only intensified the king's rage. Unable to tolerate their hesitation, he himself rushed forward and killed the bishop in the middle of the sacred rite. The murder is described not as an execution, but as a profanation, a violent tearing apart of the bond between shepherd and flock, father and children, church and kingdom. The bishop's death is then made even more terrible by the mutilation that followed. His body was cut into pieces and scattered, as if the king wished not only to kill the man, but to erase his memory. That dismemberment became one of the most powerful elements in the later cult of Stanislaw. It was not preserved in memory only for shock or pathos. By the 13th century, when Poland had long been divided and politically fragmented, the image of the saint's severed body, miraculously restored, carried a meaning that went far beyond the murder itself. The bishop's body became a symbol of the kingdom, broken apart by violence, yet not beyond healing. For this reason, the later hagiographer insists so strongly on the cutting and scattering of the remains. In his hands, Stanislaw is no longer merely a murdered bishop. He becomes a martyr, a defender of justice, and a living emblem of the hope that what has been divided may one day be made whole again. The writer's own feelings are unmistakable. He does not tell the story with detachment. His language is charged with grief, outrage, and reverence. The king is not simply harsh, he is cast as a tyrant corrupted by pride and bloodshed. The bishop is not simply a victim, he is a righteous pastor whose death reveals the holiness of the church and the guilt of unjust rule. Farther south, in the Serbian lands, another great figure was shaping a very different legacy. Stephen Nemanja, who had ruled as Grand Župan and built his power through military success, political skill, and territorial expansion, ended his life by turning away from the throne. After giving up power in favour of his son, he entered the monastic life and took the name Simeon. This change did not erase his past. On the contrary, when he established the monastery of Hilandar on Mount Athos, together with his son Sava, he narrated his own life in a way that linked rule, conquest, inheritance, and renunciation into a single sacred story. He begins by presenting political order itself as part of divine design. God, in his view, did not create rulers to destroy people, but to guide and protect them. Nations had been given their own laws and customs, and rulers had been appointed over them by divine wisdom. In that framework, Nemanja's own rise was not an accident of ambition. It was a providential calling. He recounts the lands he inherited, the territories he restored, and the regions he conquered, presenting his career not as naked acquisition, but as the strengthening of what had fallen into weakness. His victories, his rebuilding of patrimony, and the peace that later reigned over his realm all appear as signs of divine favour joined to personal effort. Yet the Charter for Hilandar is not simply a political memoir. It is also an act of withdrawal. Nemanja makes clear that he has left his throne to his son Stephen, whom he blesses in language that deliberately echoes the blessing of the patriarchs. He passes on power, but he also passes on moral responsibility. The new ruler is instructed to protect Christians, churches, and all those who serve within them. In this way, Nemanja presents his family not merely as a dynasty holding land, but as a line entrusted with a sacred duty. Even so, his attitude toward family is marked by a certain distance. Blood matters, inheritance matters, blessing matters, but all of these are ultimately subordinated to the spiritual destiny of the monastery. The endowment of Hilandar is protected against claims even from his own descendants. Children, grandchildren, cousins, or any other relatives are forbidden to seize what has been given. Once offered to God, these possessions are removed from the ordinary cycle of dynastic ambition. His description of Mount Athos reveals deep reverence. He does not present it as an ordinary monastic region, but as a holy landscape already sanctified by prayer, ascetic life, and the presence of the Mother of God. When he found Hilandar ruined, he did not see abandonment as a reason to pass by. He saw in the ruin a call to restore. The monastery, dedicated to the presentation of the Virgin, became for him both a work of devotion and a statement of identity. Through imperial permission, he secured villages, market rights, vineyards, beehives, pasture land, and labour obligations for the new foundation. He also transferred Vlach households under its jurisdiction, counting them carefully. Their mention is practical and revealing. They appear not as an abstract ethnic category, but as a mobile labouring population whose obligations mattered in sustaining the economic life of the monastery. This resembles other medieval texts, in which Vlachs are treated less as a cultural curiosity than as a social group tied to pastoral and service functions. Nemanya's concern is administrative. Who belongs to the monastery? Who may flee and who must be returned? The monastery is not imagined as a place floating above the world. It is a land-holding institution that must be protected, provisioned, and guaranteed against encroachment. This same blending of sanctity and worldly authority appears in the memory of St. Sava, Nemanja's son, though in a different register. By the time later, writers described Sava's final journey to the Holy Land, he had already become far more than an archbishop or monastic founder. He had become a saintly architect of the Serbian Church, and the account of his second pilgrimage is shaped to confirm that status. Domentian does not describe him as a simple traveller driven by curiosity or personal devotion alone. He appears instead as a holy leader who, after securing good order in his homeland, deliberately chooses to leave it once more in order to complete his life in a foreign land. Before departing, he arranges succession carefully, entrusting the church and the people to his chosen disciple Arsenie. He gives blessings, speaks words of peace, and sets out not empty-handed but carrying gold and silver, both for the expenses of the journey and for alms to churches and the poor. From the beginning, then, the pilgrimage is framed not as private piety, but as the final act of a man whose holiness is inseparable from responsibility, generosity, and foresight. The sea voyage itself is narrated in a miraculous mode. Pirates prepare to ambush him, yet fog conceals his ship until danger has passed. When the would-be attackers later come to him, confessing what they had planned, Sava answers, not with fear or punishment, but with food, gifts, blessing, and instruction. In this moment, he appears as a holy man who transforms violence through mercy. Soon after, a storm threatens the ship, and once again the saint is shown as master over danger. At the cries of the frightened travellers, he stretches out his hand, makes the sign of the cross, and commands the wind and the sea to be still. The calm returns at once. Such scenes are not included to make him look like an adventurous pilgrim. They are meant to place him in the company of biblical holy men, to show that nature itself responds to his authority, because that authority comes from God. Once in the Holy Land and beyond, Sava moves through sacred geography with extraordinary prestige. In Jerusalem, he venerates the Holy Sepulchre and other holy places with intense devotion. In Alexandria, he is welcomed with honour by the Patriarch, and from there he visits monasteries and desert communities associated with the great ascetics of Christian memory. He travels through places heavy with biblical and monastic resonance, and the selection of sites is meaningful. He is taken to places tied to the life of the Virgin, to Moses, to the great fathers of the desert, to the relics of martyrs, and to ancient scenes of divine revelation. These are not random stops. Each one deepens the image of Sava as a saint moving through the most charged landscapes of Christian memory. The point is not to record every possible shrine, but to lead the audience through a chain of places where holiness, antiquity, and scriptural memory converge around him. At the same time, the scope of the journey stretches beyond ordinary pilgrimage. The narrative sends him not only through Jerusalem and Egypt, but also to Babylon, to powerful rulers, and to centres of non-orthodox authority. Whether historically exact or not, this literary geography matters. The saint is welcomed by patriarchs, bishops, and sultans. Muslim rulers receive him with honour and provide escorts and provisions. He gives gifts, distributes alms, venerates relics, climbs Sinai repeatedly for prayer, and searches for holy objects to bring back to his homeland. All of this turns him into more than a penitent visitor. He appears as an international holy figure, recognised across confessional and political boundaries. Domitian is clearly trying to accomplish something larger than the narration of a journey. He is constructing a saint whose authority reaches from Serbia to the centres of the Christian East, and even into the courts of Islamic rulers. The pilgrimage thus serves to magnify the prestige of the Serbian Church itself. If Sava can move with such sanctity and honour through the Holy Land, Egypt, Sinai, Antioch, and beyond, then the church he founded at home is also elevated in stature. The insistence on this pilgrimage has several purposes. It completes Sava's image as a holy man detached from worldly attachment, even after he had ruled and organised so much. It links Serbia to the geography of salvation history. It reinforces the legitimacy of the archbishop as both monk and statesman. And it presents his final years not as decline, but as fulfillment. His road outward becomes a path inward towards sanctity. In this vision, leaving the homeland is not abandonment. It is the final proof that he belongs not only to one people, but to the universal Christian world. Against such figures and institutions, medieval Orthodox authors often define themselves by opposition to heresy, and one of the strongest examples appears in the condemnation of the Bogomils under the Bulgarian Emperor Boril. The synod held in Tarnovo in 1211 was presented as a great act of defending orthodoxy, and the document that preserves its judgments speaks in the language of curse, purification, and public identification of error. The Bogomils are associated with older dualist currents, especially Manichaean and Messalian ideas, and are described as people who deny the true incarnation of Christ, reject baptism with water, despise the liturgy, refuse the veneration of the cross and icons, and scorn the authority of the Church. In broad outline, this agrees with earlier descriptions of Bogomil beliefs. Like the account of Cosmas the Presbyter, the Synodicon emphasizes their rejection of the material dimension of Christian worship, and their teaching that the visible world is the work of Satan rather than of God. But by the early 13th century, the list of accusations has become more expanded and more systematic, shaped by the needs of formal condemnation. What emerges from this text is not only a picture of heresy, but also a picture of society. The very acts that are singled out tell us what Orthodox authorities considered essential. To reject the liturgy, icons, baptism, the saints, sacred song, and the holy building itself was to reject the visible bonds that held Christian society together. The repeated condemnation of nocturnal gatherings, secret rites, and alternative forms of prayer shows anxiety about hidden communities operating inside the larger social body. References to midsummer rituals, spells, and fruit gathering on the feast of St. John reveal how closely religious concern intersected with the survival of popular practices that authorities regarded as dangerously close to paganism. The text makes clear that orthodoxy was defined not only by belief, but by participation in public and visible forms of worship. A Bogomil, according to this evidence, might be recognized by what he refused. The Church, the liturgy, icons, the cross, baptism with water, the Old Testament, and fellowship with the Orthodox. He might also be known by private gatherings, suspicious teachings about creation and childbirth, and contempt for sacred objects that others revered. The mention of the heresy in Constantinople is significant for the same reason. It shows that the issue was not treated as a local Bulgarian curiosity, by recalling Basil, the physician, condemned in the imperial capital. The Synodicon places the Bulgarian struggle within a wider Orthodox battle against error. This gives weight to Borel's assembly. It suggests that by attacking Bogomelism, he was defending not merely his own realm, but the order of Christendom itself. At the same time, the appeal to Constantinople strengthens the prestige of the condemnation by linking it to earlier imperial action. The Bulgarian court and church appear as heirs to a larger Orthodox mission, guardians of true belief in continuity with the capital of the Byzantine world. In the years around the First Crusade, Hungary stood in a difficult and dangerous position. Armies of armed pilgrims were moving eastward toward Jerusalem, but before reaching the lands of Byzantium and the eastern Mediterranean, they first had to cross the kingdoms of Central Europe. For the rulers of those regions, this was not a simple matter of hospitality. It raised questions of order, supply, safety, and trust. Among the most important of these encounters was the passage of Duke Godfrey and his followers through the Kingdom of Hungary under King Koloman. Later writers remembered this episode not as a smooth march of holy warriors, but as a tense and carefully managed crossing shaped by suspicion on both sides. By the time Godfrey and the leading nobles of his army approached Hungary, the memory of earlier crusading groups had already darkened the road. Previous bands had entered the kingdom in disorder, and some had ended in catastrophe. Others had plundered settlements, seized livestock, stolen valuables, attacked local people, and laid siege to strongpoints when discipline collapsed. In the Hungarian view, these were not peaceful pilgrims, but armed multitudes capable of devastation. In the Crusaders' view, however, news had spread that Christians heading for Jerusalem had suffered harsh treatment in Hungary, even slaughter. As a result, when Godfrey and his companions reached the frontier, they did not simply march forward with confidence. They hesitated, discussed what had happened before them, and wondered how they could discover the truth without exposing their own army to the same danger. A decision was made to proceed through diplomacy first. Since one among them already had prior contact with the Hungarian court, he was sent ahead with a small delegation to speak directly with King Koloman. The message brought before the king was sharp and openly suspicious. It asked why Christians had been treated so cruelly, and why previous companies had been denied safe passage. The crusading leaders wanted an explanation, and until one was given, they preferred to delay rather than walk blindly into disaster. This was the atmosphere in which the negotiations began. One side fearful of betrayal, the other offended by accusations and determined to justify its conduct. Koloman's answer was firm and political. He denied that he had acted out of hatred toward Christians. In his version of events, Hungary had first received crusading groups peacefully, allowed them to buy provisions, and granted them safe passage. The violence came later, after some of those groups repaid generosity with robbery, destruction, and bloodshed. From that point onward, the Hungarian response was presented as an act of defence, not persecution. When later crusading bands appeared armed, proud, and aggressive, the king and his nobles believed they were facing an invading host rather than a company of penitents. This explanation was meant to reverse the moral accusation. If there had been bloodshed in Hungary, it had come from necessity, not malice. Even while giving this justification, Koloman acted with calculated courtesy. The envoys were treated honourably and entertained well. He did not answer suspicion with insult. Instead, he invited a direct meeting with Godfrey himself, offering a conference under carefully controlled conditions. The encounter that followed was not staged as a royal humiliation of the Crusaders, nor as a triumph of crusading pressure over a fearful king. It was a negotiation between two rulers, each aware that one misstep could trigger a war. When they finally met, the exchange appears to have been respectful and deliberate. Greetings were exchanged, peace was discussed, and the basis for trust began to take shape. But trust was not enough by itself. Koloman had every reason to be cautious. Godfrey was not arriving with a small embassy or a modest pilgrimage train. He was leading an enormous armed force. No sensible ruler could simply throw open his roads, markets, and fortifications to such a mass without guarantees. For that reason, the king demanded hostages from among the most important members of the crusading leadership. This was the clearest sign of how little room there was for illusion. The passage through Hungary would not be granted on pious promises alone. It would be secured through a political mechanism strong enough to restrain even powerful men. The most striking of these hostages was Godfrey's own brother, Baldwin, together with Baldwin's wife and household. This demand was not made casually. By asking for people so close to the Duke, Koloman ensured that any disorder, theft, or violence committed by the crusading army could not be dismissed or excused. Godfrey would have to control his followers because the lives and safety of his own family were now tied to their behaviour. That was the king's purpose. He needed leverage powerful enough to prevent the repetition of earlier chaos. If previous crusading groups had been dangerous because no one could restrain them, then this company would be different only if its leaders were forced to accept direct responsibility. Once the agreement was sealed, the passage itself was managed with unusual strictness. Godfrey imposed discipline on his own army and publicly forbade looting, seizure of goods, and any disturbance of the peace. Everything was to be bought at a fair price. At the same time, Koloman issued matching instructions throughout his realm. Supplies were to be offered for sale, and the Hungarians were forbidden to exploit the army through extortion or provocation. This double system of command reveals the real achievement of the negotiations. The crossing of Hungary was made possible not by religious enthusiasm, but by law, surveillance, and reciprocal restraint. The Crusaders did not simply pass because they were pilgrims. They passed because both sides agreed on a framework that prevented open conflict. That is also why Koloman continued to monitor their movement with cavalry throughout much of the crossing. This was not an honor guard in the romantic sense. It was protection, supervision, and pressure all at once. The king wanted to make sure the Crusaders kept to the agreed terms, purchased rather than plundered, and moved steadily forward without spreading into the countryside in search of easy gain. His mounted force on the flank of the army served as a constant reminder that the Hungarians were watching, prepared, and ready to respond if the agreement broke down. The goal was not to provoke battle, but to prevent it by making Hungarian power visible every step of the way. The same logic explains another detail that might otherwise seem surprising. The king did not simply furnish the Crusaders with all the means required to cross every great river on their route. At the Drava and later near the Sava, the army had to improvise crossing methods using available vessels, rafts, timber, and reeds. This was not negligence. It was policy. A ruler who had already been forced to deal with unruly crusading bands had no reason to supply a massive foreign host with easy mobility beyond what was necessary. To have done so would have increased their independence and reduced his own control over their progress. By limiting direct logistical support, Koloman avoided strengthening an armed force whose final intentions he could never know with certainty. He helped create the conditions for passage, but he did not turn himself into the quartermaster of a potentially hostile army. Seen from this angle, the mistrust between the Crusade leaders and the Hungarian king becomes entirely understandable. The Crusaders feared that Hungary might again become a place of massacre and betrayal. The king feared that another wave of armed pilgrims might devastate his kingdom in the name of religion while behaving like conquerors. Albert's account gives both sides a voice, but it also frames the whole episode as a lesson in discipline, humility, and the consequences of earlier sins. The crossing succeeds only when force is restrained, pride is lowered, and both sides submit to negotiated order. Several decades later, the route through Hungary again became central to crusading movement, this time in the context of the Second Crusade. By then, the passage to the east was no longer an improvised experiment. It had become one of the recognized roads by which Western armies might travel toward the Holy Land. Yet enthusiasm for the new expedition still had to be created, justified, and organized. One of the voices that tried to do this was Bernard of Clairvaux, whose appeal to the Duke of Bohemia and the leading men of that land shows how crusading ideology was presented to Central European audiences. Bernard did not speak in the language of strategy first. He spoke in the language of salvation. For him, the crusade was a moment of extraordinary divine mercy, a rare opening in history through which sinners could receive pardon. He presented the campaign not simply as a military expedition, but as a unique opportunity offered by God to a sinful generation. This was one of his strongest arguments. The men of Bohemia were told that a special grace had descended from heaven, one greater than what earlier generations had known. To accept the cross was to step into a sacred season of remission and forgiveness. In this way, Bernard transformed what could look like danger and hardship into a privileged spiritual offer. He also appealed to loyalty and honor. The land of Christ, sanctified by his life, miracles, blood, and tomb, was described as being under threat from enemies. That threat was not cast only as a territorial problem. It was treated as an insult to Christ himself. Bernard says, in effect, that the enemies of the faith accused the Christian Lord of weakness, as though he were a false king unable to defend his own inheritance. This turns the crusade into a matter of fealty. If Christ's honour is being challenged, then his servants must rise and defend him. That is why Bernard calls the crusade the business of Christ. It is Christ's cause, Christ's land, Christ's honour, and therefore the responsibility of those who claim to belong to him. Another important element in Bernard's appeal is urgency. He insists that this opportunity will not return in the same form. Earthly concerns can wait. Ordinary business can be managed later. The cause of Christ must come first. By structuring the call in this way, Bernard pressures his audience morally. Delay becomes not mere hesitation but failure. To put anything above the crusade is to misunderstand the scale of the moment. He is careful to combine this urgency with reward. Pardon for confessed sins, glory in battle, and spiritual gain even in death. The campaign is therefore presented as uniquely safe in a spiritual sense, even if it is dangerous in a bodily one. One detail in Bernard's message is especially revealing. He forbids luxury in ordinary dress and equipment during the march, yet allows gold and silver in battle. This is not a contradiction so much as a rhetorical compromise. On the one hand, he wants crusaders to adopt austerity, to reject vanity, softness, and worldly display during the holy enterprise. On the other hand, he understands the mentality of aristocratic warfare. In battle, splendid arms and shining equipment could have both symbolic and practical value. They could inspire courage, project rank, and strike fear into opponents. Bernard therefore makes room for martial display at the very moment of combat, while condemning excess as a lifestyle. He is trying to keep the expedition spiritually serious, without ignoring the culture of the knightly class. He needs to mobilize. His mention that a copy of the letter has been sent to the Pope also serves a purpose. It reinforces authority. Bernard is not presenting himself as a private enthusiast or wandering preacher whose words can be politely admired and then set aside. He is connecting his message directly to the highest institutional voice in Western Christendom. By reminding the Bohemian audience that the Pope is also involved, he strengthens obedience, reduces room for hesitation, and signals that this crusade is not merely one holy man's enthusiasm, but a sanctioned undertaking of the Church itself. If Bernard's appeal shows how crusading was preached, Otto of Freising shows how it was remembered and interpreted in relation to Hungary during the same broad era. His account, however, is very different in tone. Where Bernard calls men eastward with promise and conviction, Otto inserts Hungary into a broader narrative coloured by aristocratic prejudice, political rivalry, and cultural disdain. His description is one of the clearest examples of how an educated churchman from the German world could present Hungary as both rich in land and deeply inferior in civilization. Before offering that portrait, Otto recounts a conflict involving the capture of Pressburg and the response of King Geza. The episode is tied to the ambitions of Boris, a claimant to the Hungarian throne and to the intervention of German knights acting not openly for emperor or duke, but for that claimant. When the Hungarians recover the fortress after negotiation, Geza becomes suspicious that the larger German political world stands behind the attack. Otto uses this incident as an entry point into a broader explanation of Hungary itself. But the explanation is anything but neutral. His Hungary is a land of natural abundance inhabited by a people he describes in degrading terms. He admits the beauty and fertility of the country, comparing it to paradise or Egypt. Yet he uses that very richness to sharpen his contempt. How strange, he suggests, that such a land should belong to such people. Their appearance, language, customs, settlements, and political habits are all presented as crude, barbarous, or barely human. The contrast is deliberate. The more beautiful the land, the harsher the insult directed at those who rule it. This is not ethnography in any objective sense. It is stereotype sharpened into literary weapon. From Otto's description, several common Western stereotypes become clear. Hungary is portrayed as a frontier land only half civilized, still marked by memories of Huns, Avars, and nomadic invaders. Urban life is treated as weak, architecture as poor, and social customs as rough. The king's authority is described as overwhelming and arbitrary, with nobles rendered silent and submissive. Even military organization is framed in a way that implies mass obedience rather than honorable freedom. Otto's account is less interested in understanding Hungary than in placing it lower on a moral and cultural ladder whose standard is German aristocratic society. At the same time, the description contains details that unintentionally reveal something real. Hungary appears as a kingdom with extensive royal authority, strong fiscal claims, centralized military obligations, and a population capable of rapid mobilization. It is rich in fields, rivers, forests, and pasture. It contains foreigners serving at court and in war. It relies on counties, officials, and a disciplined response to royal command. Even through Otto's contempt, one can see a functioning kingdom with its own political logic and military depth. His scorn is revealing not only of Hungary, but of himself and his world. This becomes even clearer when his portrait is compared with more favourable descriptions from other traditions. Where Otto emphasises barbarism, other observers stress prosperity, scale, and the vitality of markets and settlement. Where he sneers at the built environment, others notice wealth and movement. The contrast shows that descriptions of Hungary were often shaped less by the land itself than by the political and cultural needs of the writer. Otto wanted to elevate German aristocratic order, and one way to do that was to depict Hungary as materially rich, but socially inferior. His comparison of the Hungarians to the Greeks is especially telling. It does not mean he saw them as refined or admirable in a Byzantine sense. Rather, he associates them with caution, calculation, prolonged deliberation, and what many Western writers regarded as a less straightforward political style. To compare them to the Greeks was to suggest that they lacked the open, immediate, martial frankness that writers like Otto preferred to attribute to the German aristocracy. It was another way of marking them as clever, perhaps, but not noble in the way he wished to define nobility. In the early 13th century, the Baltic world was being reshaped by war, conversion, and conquest. One of the most revealing voices for this period came from Henry of Livonia, a priest who lived among the people whose world was being transformed. He was not a distant compiler, writing from safety far away. He had travelled with bishops, seen revolt and siege, worked among newly converted communities, and watched military force become one of the chief instruments by which Latin Christianity spread across Livonia and Estonia. His account is vivid because it comes from a man who knew the terrain, knew the people, and understood that what was happening in those northern lands was not a simple mission, but a long and violent struggle over faith, loyalty, and power. Henry's attitude toward the local peoples, especially the Letgalians and other groups drawn into the conflict, is complex but never fully detached. He writes from the side of the Church of Riga and clearly sees Christianity as the rightful order toward which these peoples must be brought. Yet he does not describe them as faceless enemies. He often records their speeches, their customs, their fears, and their calculations in ways that suggest familiarity rather than total contempt. Even when he condemns apostasy, rebellion, or sacrifice to pagan gods, he still presents many local leaders as political actors making choices under pressure. His view does not become truly warmer when they accept Christianity by force, but it does become more orderly. Once they submit, receive baptism again, or renew their obedience, they move in his narrative from the category of rebels and pagans into that of wayward children returned to the church. In that sense, conversion does not make them equal partners in his eyes, but it does make them governable and redeemable. One dramatic example appears in the siege at Trident. The Bishop of Riga gathered crusaders, members of the military brotherhood, loyal townsmen, and those Livonians who had remained faithful. Their target was a fort held by men who had abandoned the Christian side and returned to resistance. From the beginning, the fighting was fierce and personal. The defenders slipped out from the rear, wounded men in the besieging force, seized horses and loot, and rushed back into the fort, shouting to their fellows to fight bravely, rather than become slaves to the Germans. That cry matters. It reveals how the defenders understood the conflict. For them, this was not merely a theological dispute. It was a struggle over freedom, subordination, and the fear of being dominated by foreign masters. The siege itself was brutal. The attackers battered the fort with stones from engines, broke down defences and pressed the walls with towers and sapping operations. The defenders answered with arrows, resistance, and ritual defiance. When one siege tower collapsed in the night, joy broke out inside the fort. Sacrifices were made to the old gods according to ancestral custom. Dogs and goats were killed, and in a direct act of mockery, their bodies were thrown out before the bishop and the entire Christian host. That moment is especially revealing. The defenders were not merely clinging to older beliefs in private. They were using those beliefs publicly as a weapon of morale and insult, setting their own ritual world against the sacred claims of the invaders. Yet Henry's story also shows that resistance had limits. The siege engines were rebuilt, the earthworks were undermined again, and the fortifications slowly began to fail. The episode involving Rusin shows how close the writer stood to the events. Henry records him leaning over the wall, removing his helmet, speaking words of peace, and trying to recall an earlier bond of friendship with the Christian commander below. In the middle of that exchange, a shot struck his head and killed him. This kind of detail does not read like distant legend. It has the sharpness of eyewitness memory or of testimony gathered from those who stood close enough to see the gesture, hear the appeal, and witness the sudden death. Rusin is not reduced to a name in a list. He appears for a moment as a living figure, recognizable in action and voice. As the siege tightened and the fort's strongest point began to crumble, fear spread among the defenders. They asked for mercy. The bishop tried to use the moment to pull them back into the sacraments and into obedience. His banner was sent into the fort as a sign of submission, but even then division broke out among the defenders. Some accepted it, while others cast it down. Violence resumed, and only when further resistance became hopeless did they finally raise the bishop's standard and ask to be spared. Henry presents this ending as a victory not only of arms, but of faith. The rebels promised to return to baptism, to observe Christian rites, and to abandon pagan practices. The bishop accepts their surrender and leads their elders back toward reconciliation. In Henry's eyes, this is what proper order looks like: military conquest ending in sacramental restoration. That same mixture of mission and force shaped the rise of the military order, later known as the Sword Brothers. Their creation came at a time when the Church of Riga still stood on uncertain foundations. Conversion was spreading, but so was revolt. The bishop and his allies knew that preaching alone could not hold territory in a land where newly baptized groups might return to old loyalties the moment armed pressure weakened. It was in this atmosphere that a new institution was formed, one meant to combine religious dedication with permanent military defense. The city of Riga had become the center of this effort. The episcopal seat had been moved there, churches and monasteries were being built, and the whole land was being placed under the protection of the Virgin Mary. But beneath this sacred language lay an unmistakable reality. If the Christian foothold in Livonia was to survive, it needed armed men bound not by temporary crusading vows alone, but by an enduring corporate discipline. The Sword Brothers were created precisely to meet that need. Their purpose was to defend the church, support the bishop, and maintain the Christian position among peoples who were still only partially conquered and often only superficially converted. They were given a religious rule, outward symbols of their calling, and a place within the larger structure of the Livonian church. Yet in practice they were not simply monks who happened to bear arms. They were a military elite planted into a volatile frontier, expected to hold forts, conduct raids, suppress rebellion, and carve out security through continual campaigning. Their world was made of district strongholds, mounted warfare, sudden marches, and repeated confrontation with peoples who did not willingly accept either their faith or their rule. As their campaigns expanded, the Sword Brothers struck again and again into the lands around them. One example comes from their operations in Estonia. They attacked the Gerwanians especially hard, killing many, taking prisoners, and carrying off spoils. After such punishment, the local people came to terms, promising perpetual loyalty to the Germans and to all Christians. That phrase captures the logic of frontier conquest. Loyalty to the new religion was inseparable from submission to the foreign, military power enforcing it. Christianity here was not being introduced into a peaceful landscape of free persuasion. It was arriving with castles, raids, hostages, and pledges extracted after devastation. Another episode reveals even more clearly the nature of the conflict. In the town of Dorpat, rebels and apostates had gathered around a prince supported by Rus. This stronghold became a centre of resistance against the Church of Livonia. The men inside had, in Henry's account, abandoned baptism driven out or killed members of the Christian military order, plundered neighbouring converts, and turned the fort into a base of anti-Christian action. Their leader refused compromise because he trusted in outside support and in the strength of the fort itself. The picture Henry paints is not only one of pagan resistance, but of a complex political world in which local rulers, Rus's princes, Estonian factions, and German church power all collided. The attack on Dorpat was therefore presented as a rescue as much as a conquest. Henry describes the Church of Livonia as coming to free its daughter, the Church of Estonia, from present troubles. This maternal language is important. It disguises violence under the language of protection and restoration. A major force was assembled under bishops, knights, crusaders, merchants, townsmen, livs, and lets. They moved with planning and religious ceremony, consulting and praying before the campaign began. Then they advanced quickly, hoping to surprise the fort and cut through resistance before reinforcements could arrive. Once again, siege warfare became central. Tents covered the field, engines were raised, and a massive wooden tower was built from tall trees and pushed toward the walls over the moat. At the same time, men dug underneath the defences day and night until large sections of the battlements began to collapse. Offers were made to the prince inside. He was promised safe departure with his men, horses and goods if he would surrender the town and abandon the apostates. He refused, trusting instead in aid from Novgorod. That decision sealed the fate of the defenders. When the breach came, attackers rushed upward in competition with one another, eager not only for victory but for glory, reward, and the honour of being first over the wall. The struggle on the ramparts was close and savage. The Estonians were forced back. The Russes resisted longest, retreating only into the citadel before they too were overwhelmed. Henry's narrative of the end is stark. The prince and roughly 200 others were killed. Only one man was deliberately spared, a servant of the Grand Prince of Suzdal, and even that act had a message behind it. He was clothed, mounted on a good horse, and sent away to carry the news back to Novgorod and Suzdal. Mercy here served politics. It was not simply an act of compassion, but a carefully staged announcement of victory. The message was clear. Dorpat had fallen, its defenders had been destroyed, and the balance of power had shifted. The way Henry tells these stories reveals why his chronicle has such force. He writes like a man who believes that this conquest has divine approval. Yet he also fills his pages with practical military detail, local names, changing alliances, tactical setbacks, and the stubbornness of people who refuse to disappear quietly. He clearly admires the endurance and organisation of the Christian side, but he also preserves enough of the resistance to show how contested the whole process was. Pagan rites, old loyalties, regional rivalries, and appeals to freedom did not vanish when baptism arrived. They resurfaced again and again, often in arms. This is also why the Sword Brothers matter so much in the larger history of the Baltic Crusades. They embodied the permanent militarization of conversion. Temporary crusading armies could win battles, but they could not remain year after year in forests, marshes, and newly seized strongholds. The Sword Brothers were created to solve that problem. They turned the frontier into an armed religious order's domain. Their existence meant that conquest would no longer depend only on seasonal influxes of pilgrims from Germany, but on a standing body of warriors committed to expansion, defense, and discipline in the region itself. At the same time, their rise intensified the nature of the conflict. Because they were rooted in forts and local administration, resistance to them also became more focused and more desperate. To oppose them was no longer merely to reject a passing expedition. It was to fight against an institution that intended to stay, rule, tax, defend, punish, and define the new religious order of the land. This helps explain both the bitterness of local resistance and Henry's insistence on framing rebellion as apostasy and treachery. Once the Christian conquest became territorial and organized, neutrality became almost impossible. What emerges from these accounts is not a simple tale of missionaries bringing faith to waiting peoples. It is a story of frontier colonization sanctified by religious language, fought through siegecraft, cavalry movement, negotiated submission, and repeated violence. Henry sees the conquest as just, necessary, and providential. He believes the rebels should be subdued and the apostates returned to the faith. Yet his own descriptions also preserve another reality. The Livonians, Latgalians, Estonians, and others were not passive recipients of a new order. They argued, resisted, made alliances, mocked the enemy's religion, shifted loyalties, and fought hard for control of their forts, their customs, and their future. In that sense, Henry's chronicle is powerful not only because it tells the story the victors wanted remembered, but because it accidentally preserves the intensity of the world they were trying to conquer. Through his pages, the Baltic Crusades appear not as a clean line of religious triumph, but as a long collision between two systems of life. One was backed by bishops, military orders, papal approval, and settlers from the German world. The other rested on local traditions, old gods, regional leadership, and the fierce desire not to become subjects of foreign power. The conquest of Livonia and Estonia emerged from that collision, and Henry, even while defending it, allows its full violence and tension to remain visible. In the northern frontier of medieval Europe, the spread of Christianity did not unfold as a quiet process of persuasion. It advanced through pressure, resistance, negotiation, and repeated violence. In this environment, the militia of Christ, later known as the Sword Brothers, emerged out of necessity rather than design alone. The church in Livonia faced a fragile reality. Conversion had begun, but it remained unstable. Newly baptized communities could return to older beliefs, local leaders could shift allegiance, and entire regions could rise against the authority of the bishop and his allies. Preaching alone was not enough to hold ground in a landscape where political control and religious loyalty were inseparable. The creation of a permanent armed force became the solution to that instability. This new brotherhood was formed to defend the Christian presence and to ensure that earlier gains would not collapse. Its members were not ordinary monks, nor were they simple warriors. They were something in between. They lived under a religious discipline, bore sacred symbols, and were tied to the church's mission. At the same time, their daily life was defined by fortification, patrol, siege, and retaliation. Their duty was clear: protect the territory controlled by the church, suppress rebellion, expand influence, and maintain order in lands that were only partially subdued. They stood as a permanent military structure in a region where temporary crusading armies could not remain year after year. Because of this dual nature, they can be understood as a monastic military order. Their identity combined spiritual purpose with organized violence. Their authority came from religion, but their power was enforced through arms. This combination made them effective, but it also intensified the conflicts around them. To resist them was not simply to oppose a passing army. It meant confronting a system that intended to remain, rule, and reshape society. The contrast between different local reactions to this expanding power becomes clear when comparing two key moments. At Trident, the defenders fought fiercely, but their resistance carried a strong emotional and symbolic dimension. They called on one another to resist domination, framed the struggle as one for freedom, and openly defied their attackers through ritual acts. They sacrificed animals according to older traditions and mocked the Christian forces in full view. Even in the middle of the siege, attempts at negotiation appeared. Familiar faces recognized each other across the walls, and there were moments where memory of past alliances briefly surfaced. When the fort began to fail, fear replaced defiance. The defenders eventually sought mercy, accepted submission, and agreed to return to Christian practices. Their resistance, though intense, was not absolute. It shifted under pressure and ultimately gave way to survival. The situation at Dorpat presents a sharper and more uncompromising form of resistance. There, opposition was organised, deliberate, and rooted in broader alliances. The defenders were not isolated rebels reacting to immediate danger. They were part of a larger network that included external support and political backing. Their leader refused negotiation even when offered safe passage. Confidence in reinforcements and in the strength of their fort made surrender unthinkable. The town became a centre of active opposition, gathering those who rejected the authority of the church and those who had already broken with it. The conflict here was not just about submission or survival. It was about control, allegiance, and the refusal to accept the new order entirely. This difference can be explained by circumstance. At Trident, resistance was local and reactive. It emerged from immediate pressure and collapsed when defeat became unavoidable. At Dorpat, resistance was structured and strategic. It was supported by wider political connections and sustained by the belief that help would arrive. Geography also mattered. Stronger fortifications, better preparation, and access to allies gave the defenders of Dorpat the confidence to continue fighting long after others might have yielded. In one case, resistance weakened under siege and fear. In the other, it hardened into a determined stand that ended only with destruction. While these struggles unfolded in the Baltic, another dramatic episode was taking shape further south during the campaign that would eventually lead to the capture of Zara. This event reveals how crusading ideals could become entangled with political and economic realities. The army that gathered for the expedition had entered into an agreement with the maritime power that provided transport. When the Crusaders failed to meet the financial terms of that agreement, the situation became critical. The fleet had been built, the forces were assembled, but the payment was incomplete. Without a solution, the entire expedition risked collapse. At this moment, the leadership of Venice introduced a proposal that would change the course of the campaign. Instead of dissolving the army or abandoning the effort, they suggested redirecting its strength toward a nearby target. The city of Zara, once under their control but now held by another ruler, became the focus. By capturing it, they could recover their losses and allow the Crusaders to delay their debt. The plan was controversial from the beginning. Many within the army opposed it, seeing it as a betrayal of the original purpose. Others feared the consequences of attacking a Christian city while claiming to be on a sacred mission. Despite opposition, the agreement moved forward. The army approached Zara and saw a city strong, wealthy, and heavily defended. Its walls were imposing, its position secure. The site itself raised doubts. Many wondered whether such a place could be taken at all without divine intervention. Yet preparations began immediately. Ships gathered, the harbour was forced open, and the army established its camp before the walls. Horses were unloaded, equipment arranged, and siege operations set in motion. Inside the city, the inhabitants watched closely. Their initial reaction was cautious but pragmatic. They attempted negotiation, offering surrender in exchange for the safety of their lives and property. At that moment, division within the crusading camp had a direct impact. Those who opposed the attack intervened, advising the defenders not to surrender. They argued that the Crusaders would not harm them, and that resistance against Venice alone might succeed. This interference disrupted the agreement and prolonged the conflict. Leadership then faced a difficult choice. Accepting the surrender would resolve the situation quickly, but internal division had already undermined trust. Refusing it meant continuing the siege against a Christian city. In the end, authority prevailed over hesitation. The argument that carried the most weight was not purely religious, but practical and political. Honor, obligation, and the need to maintain unity within the army were emphasized. Breaking the agreement with Venice was seen as a greater danger than the moral dilemma of attacking Zara. The siege began in full force. Engines were assembled, walls were battered, and sappers worked beneath the fortifications. The attack continued for several days. Eventually, the defenders returned to their earlier position and offered the same terms they had once proposed. This time, the city was accepted on those conditions. It was taken, its people spared, and its resources divided between the allies. What had begun as a crusading expedition toward the east had already shifted into a campaign shaped by debt, negotiation, and political necessity. The aftermath revealed how fragile unity within the army truly was. Once inside the city, conflict broke out between the very groups that had fought together. A violent clash erupted between different factions, spreading through the streets and turning into widespread fighting. Weapons were drawn, men were wounded, and lives were lost. Efforts to restore order were slow and difficult. Leaders had to intervene repeatedly to separate combatants and prevent further destruction. For a moment, the entire expedition stood on the edge of collapse, not because of an external enemy, but because of internal division. This episode highlights a deeper truth about the crusading movement. Ideals of faith and unity often clashed with the realities of politics, economics, and human rivalry. The campaign against Zara was not driven by religious necessity alone. It was shaped by agreements, obligations, and the struggle to hold an army together under difficult conditions. The inhabitants of the city, for their part, saw the approaching force not simply as pilgrims, but as a powerful and unpredictable army capable of negotiation or destruction. Their willingness to surrender shows that they understood the balance of power clearly, even if events within the crusading camp delayed the outcome. In both the Baltic and the Adriatic, the same pattern emerges. Military force, religious purpose, and political calculation were deeply intertwined. Orders like the Sword Brothers turned faith into a permanent structure of control in frontier regions. Campaigns like the Siege of Zara showed how quickly the original aims of a crusade could shift under pressure. Resistance, whether in Livonia or in a fortified coastal city, was shaped by local conditions, alliances, and the choices of leaders on both sides. In the political and religious world of medieval Eastern Europe, law, war, and faith were deeply entangled. Rulers and churchmen did not treat military campaigns as separate from theology, and they did not see law as merely a way to settle practical disputes. Law was expected to defend the social order, protect Christian life, reinforce hierarchy, and define who belonged inside the community and who stood outside it. By the 13th century, this way of thinking shaped both crusading policy and legal culture across Hungary, Bulgaria, Rus, Moravia, and the Croatian lands. One striking example came in the late 1230s, when the papacy tried to direct the language and machinery of crusade not only against non-Christians, but also against rulers judged to be dangerous to Latin Christendom. Earlier popes had already supported campaigns in Bosnia against those described as unbelievers and heretics. These efforts created a pattern that could later be extended beyond Bosnia itself. After the Bosnian fighting, the Pope turned his attention toward Bulgaria and its ruler, John II Asen. He was portrayed not simply as a political rival, but as a man who had betrayed the Catholic cause. His offence, in the eyes of Rome, was not only his break with Catholic alignment, but also his willingness to associate with forces hostile to the Latin Empire and to shelter those suspected of heresy. That combination made him useful as an enemy in crusading rhetoric. He could be described as treacherous because he had abandoned an earlier religious and political orientation and had instead joined powers opposed to papal interests. For the Pope, Hungary was the natural place from which such a campaign might be launched. The Hungarian crown stood close to the region, had already taken part in anti-heretical warfare, and had both military reach and political ambitions in the Balkans. The papal appeal offered the same spiritual rewards granted to those who fought for the Holy Land. Anyone who took the cross and personally laboured in the campaign could receive full remission of sins. The offer did not end there. The papacy also signalled that lands associated with heresy could be lawfully occupied and possessed by Catholic rulers. In effect, the crusade was justified on two levels at once. Spiritually, it was framed as a defence of Christendom against corruption and false belief. Politically, it opened the door for territorial expansion. The campaign never came into being, but its proclamation reveals how flexible crusading ideology had become. A Christian realm could be treated as a legitimate target if its ruler was presented as schismatic, disloyal, or contaminated by heresy. The aim was not only punishment, it was also to redraw the balance of power in the Balkans, strengthen Catholic influence, and potentially bring Bulgaria into a more direct orbit of papal and Hungarian control. A very different kind of text from the Slavic world shows how Christian rulers also tried to reshape society from within. In the legal tradition associated with Methodius and the early Slavic Church, translated and adapted law became an instrument for moral discipline as well as civil order. The legal collection, often called the court law for the people, reflects this effort. Drawing from Byzantine models but altering them to suit local conditions, it does not simply copy imperial legislation. Instead, it modifies punishments, expands concern over pagan customs, and reveals a society in which warfare, slavery, sanctuary, and sexual conduct were all treated as matters requiring both public regulation and religious oversight. At the very beginning, the law places divine justice above every other form of justice. That opening is important because it sets the tone for everything that follows. Pagan sacrifice and oath-taking are treated as grave offences against the Christian order. If such practices are found in a village, the village and its possessions are to be handed over to the church. If powerful men in that village are the ones preserving those rights, they are to be sold along with their property, and the proceeds are to be distributed to the poor. This is an exceptionally severe response, and it shows that the law was written for a society where older religious habits had not fully disappeared. The purpose was not only to condemn paganism, but to strip it of social protection and economic support. The law also offers a revealing vision of war. A man going into battle is told to avoid evil speech and wicked conduct, to keep his mind fixed on God, and to seek divine aid rather than trust only in force. Victory is described as something granted by God rather than won by numbers alone. The distribution of spoils is also regulated with care. The prince receives a sixth part, while the rest belongs to the people. Great and small are to share alike, and noblemen are expected to accept what comes through the prince's portion, rather than seize more for themselves. Those who performed bravely may receive extra rewards, but these too are to come through lawful distribution. This provision is especially important because it shows an attempt to control tensions inside the warband. Spoils were not left entirely to raw power, they were placed within a moral and political framework that aimed to preserve cohesion and acknowledge merit, without allowing elite greed to break the order of the army. Other articles show how strongly the law regulates sexual behaviour and kinship. A man who marries his godmother or has sexual relations with his goddaughter is subject to separation and a long period of penance. The text lays out that penance in careful stages, beginning with exclusion from the church and ending only after many years of discipline. The same principle extends to relations with married women. This is clearly an area where church law shapes the response, because the concern is not only social damage, but spiritual pollution. Some Byzantine penalties are softened or replaced, yet the moral gravity remains. The law is restrictive, but not in a random way. It tries to restore order through punishment, repentance, and re-entry into the Christian community. Violence against women is also addressed directly. A man who assaults a virgin in an isolated place where she cannot be defended is to be sold, and his property is to be given to the victim. Sanctuary is protected with similar seriousness. Anyone who flees into a church must not be dragged out by force. Priests are to hear the case, shelter the fugitive, and hold him until a lawful inquiry can be made. Anyone who tries to seize that person violently from the church is to be whipped until blood is drawn. This provision shows both the prestige of sacred space and the role of the clergy as guardians of due process. Even when guilt is suspected, the church remains a place where raw retaliation must pause. Slavery appears repeatedly in this legal world, not as a marginal institution, but as a familiar social reality. Prisoners of war could be bought and sold. If a captive could repay his purchase price, he might regain freedom. If not, he remained in servitude until he could ransom himself. A soldier who had abandoned the Christian faith, while in captivity and later returned, was to be handed over to the church. A runaway slave hidden by another person created liability for the one who concealed him. These rules suggest a society in which bondage, war capture, and conditional freedom were built into everyday legal thinking. Slavery functioned as punishment, as labor, as a commercial asset, and as a consequence of warfare. The law does not question its legitimacy. It assumes it. The legal culture of Ruses developed in a related but distinct direction. The text associated with Grand Prince Yaroslav gave the church broad powers over matters of marriage, sexuality, and moral discipline. It begins by declaring that such disputes should not be judged by the prince, his officials, or secular courts, but by the metropolitan and bishops. That transfer of jurisdiction is extremely significant. It means the church was not limited to narrow, ritual concerns. It was being entrusted with some of the most sensitive areas of social life, including abduction, rape, adultery, divorce, and forbidden unions. The penalties reveal both hierarchy and moral priorities. In cases of abduction or rape, the amount paid depends heavily on the social rank of the woman involved. A boyar's daughter receives far higher compensation than a woman of lower standing. Payment is divided between the victim and the metropolitan, which makes clear that the offence is seen in two ways at once: as an injury to a person and family, and as a violation of Christian order that concerns the church. Additional punishment from the prince may follow, so ecclesiastical and princely justice work side by side rather than cancelling each other out. The statute also pays close attention to marriage and sexual misconduct. A man who enters a second marriage without ending the first must return to his first wife, while the second woman is sent to a monastery. A wife who takes another husband or commits adultery faces monastic confinement as well, and the second husband is fined. Illness is explicitly rejected as grounds for divorce, whether the sick spouse is the husband or the wife. That rule is revealing. Divorce is made extremely difficult because marriage is treated as a binding and enduring union, not as an arrangement that can be dissolved for convenience or hardship. The statute does not spend much time explaining this in abstract terms, but its logic is clear. Marriage is to be preserved, and private dissatisfaction does not outweigh its sacramental and social importance. Some of the most severe moral boundaries appear in the rules governing relations between Christians and non-Christians. If a Jewish man or a Muslim enters into a relationship with a Rusis woman, a heavy fine is imposed on him, and the woman is sent to a monastery. If a Christian man has sexual relations with a Muslim or Jewish woman and refuses to break the connection, he is to be excommunicated and fined. The Metropolitan is given authority in these matters because they are not treated merely as private sexual offences. They touch baptism, religious belonging, communal purity, and the boundary between the Christian population and those outside it. The Church claims these cases because they concern the integrity of the faith itself. The statute also punishes acts that might seem surprising to a modern reader. Cutting off another man's hair or beard brings a heavy fine. That penalty makes sense only when one understands the symbolic value of male hair and beard in medieval Rus. Such an act was not a trivial insult. It was a public humiliation, an attack on honour, masculinity, and social standing. The same can be said of various provisions dealing with magic, amulets, potions, forbidden foods, or dining with the unbaptized. These rules belong to a society still defining its Christian identity with unusual intensity. Religious conformity was not assumed. It had to be enforced, repeated, and protected in daily life. The Hungarian laws associated with King Koloman show another frontier society still consolidating Christianity. The text preserves concern for monasteries, church endowments, local assemblies, and property grants, but it also reveals anxiety about groups living within the kingdom who did not fully share the dominant religion. Villages of Muslims were required to build churches, and their inhabitants were to be dispersed, so that they would no longer live entirely among themselves. The policy is clearly assimilationist. It seeks to break communal separation and draw Muslims into the practices and rhythms of Christian life. The same impulse appears in the order that Muslim hosts and their guests eat pork when dining. This was not simply about food. It was a forced public violation of Islamic law, a means of testing conformity and dissolving difference. Jews were also heavily restricted. They were forbidden to buy or sell Christian slaves, and could not keep Christians in their service. If they owned agricultural land, they were expected to work it with pagan slaves rather than Christian labourers. They were allowed to possess property if wealthy enough, but their residence was limited to episcopal centres. Both Jews and Muslims were tolerated in some practical sense, but tightly controlled. Neither group was treated as equal to Christians. Both were subject to laws designed either to contain them or to pressure them into closer conformity with the Christian majority. Compared with the statute from Russes, the Hungarian material places strong emphasis on public integration and visible control. In Russes, mixed sexual relations are handled as sins that threaten the religious body and therefore fall under metropolitan jurisdiction. In Hungary, Muslims and Jews are regulated more directly through settlement, diet, labour, and residence. The Church also appears as a judicial authority in specific matters. Cases of abduction of women are assigned to bishops or archdeacons. Clerical marriage violations are handled through ecclesiastical discipline. Burials of Christians must take place in churchyards. These are all signs of a kingdom still shaping Christian society at ground level, where canon law and royal authority cooperate to transform everyday practice. The legal tradition known as Ruskaya Pravda reveals a somewhat different balance between old custom and formalized compensation. It focuses less on spiritual purity and more on violence, injury, theft, threats, and property disputes. Yet it too belongs to a society in transition. Blood vengeance is still present in principle. A brother may avenge a brother, a son a father a son, a nephew an uncle. But vengeance is increasingly channeled into financial compensation. If no avenger steps forward, the killer pays a set amount for the dead man. This marks an important shift. Personal revenge has not disappeared, but it is being restrained and gradually replaced by a legal system based on payment, rank, and recognized procedure. The same pattern appears in the treatment of assault. Bruising and bleeding may be enough to establish injury without witnesses, while lesser cases require testimony. Striking with a fist, a rod, a cup, or even the back of the hand carries a fixed fine. Threatening with an unsheathed sword also incurs a penalty. More serious mutilation brings much higher compensation. The law seeks to control escalation. Instead of allowing every quarrel to become a feud, it translates bodily harm into measured liability. The basis of conflict resolution is not abstract equality, but compensation calibrated according to injury, status, and proof. The articles on moustaches and beards stand out for the same reason they do in other East Slavic material. Cutting them is punished heavily because facial hair carried enormous, symbolic weight. It was bound up with dignity, adulthood, and public honour. To damage it was to disgrace a man in a visible and lasting way. The law, therefore, treats such an act as a serious offence, not a minor insult. Property violations are handled with similar care. A stolen horse, weapon, or piece of clothing cannot simply be seized back by force once recognised. The claimant must bring the matter to a legal meeting so that possession and transfer can be examined. This insistence on process suggests that the code was not only defending property, but also trying to prevent cycles of retaliatory violence arising from disputed ownership. Slavery also appears here as a normal part of legal life. A hidden slave must be returned, and the owner receives compensation. This again shows a society where human beings were recognized as property under law, and where the legal system took seriously the recovery of such property. The code is not interested in abolishing private vengeance all at once. Instead, it surrounds vengeance with procedures, witnesses, and fines, slowly drawing conflict into a more regulated framework. Further west, in the Croatian region of Vinodol, the legal world looks different again, but it is shaped by many of the same concerns: authority, social control, testimony, and the rights of rulers over communities. The law code issued there in the late 13th century emerged in a tense political setting, after local people had come under the stronger rule of the Counts of Crick. The text claims to preserve old and tested customs, but in reality, it also helps define a new balance between local society and princely power. The interests most clearly protected are those of the ruling princes, their officers, and the institutions through which they governed. The code regulates what bishops may take during church consecrations, how much local people must provide to visiting rulers, and under what conditions princely agents may seize livestock or supplies. Even when such seizure is allowed, the prince is expected to pay, which suggests an effort to distinguish lawful authority from arbitrary plunder. Yet the social hierarchy is unmistakable. The prince, his servants, his vice-counts, and his retainers occupy a privileged place in the legal order. That becomes even clearer in homicide cases. If someone kills one of the prince's men and escapes, the prince may impose whatever compensation he sees fit, though only half may be collected from the criminal's family. If the killer is caught, the prince or his representative may take revenge directly upon him. The family then escapes punishment. This provision shows a legal system in which vengeance still exists, but under the control of princely authority. The ruler absorbs and directs retaliation. The code is also deeply concerned with credibility, oaths, and witnesses. A bailiff cannot simply make large claims about goods given, borrowed, or distributed unless credible witnesses support him. An innkeeper's word is limited without testimony. Trade books are not automatically trusted unless backed by witnesses and confirmed by oath. This does not necessarily mean that bailiffs were assumed to be especially dishonest as individuals. Rather, their position gave them access to goods, accounts, and transactions that could be disputed, and the law therefore demanded safeguards against abuse. Oaths on the Gospels and the testimony of reputable witnesses functioned as the means by which truth could be stabilized in court. Witnesses in this system are central. They validate claims, limit false accusation, and protect the court from endless counter-challenges. If someone tries to discredit a witness or official, he must be ready to prove the charge through other witnesses. Unsupported accusation is not enough. The law tries to prevent the collapse of legal trust by placing strict conditions on who may contest testimony and how. It also restricts political assembly. No meeting concerning communal affairs may take place without the prince's agent present. Anyone acting otherwise risks losing property to the prince. This is a very strong statement of control. It shows that public organisation itself had become a matter watched by lordship. By the later Middle Ages, the legal culture of the Eastern Adriatic had become highly developed, layered, and deeply shaped by the political realities of the region. Zadar offers one of the clearest examples of this process. Although the surviving form of its statute is usually associated with the early 14th century, the legal core of the text appears to reach back several decades earlier. Over time, new regulations were added. Older provisions were reorganized, and outside influence became increasingly visible, especially as Venice tightened its hold over the city. What emerged was not a simple collection of rules, but a carefully ordered urban legal system, arranged into separate sections dealing with office holding, court procedure, property, trade, inheritance, maritime matters, public order, and threats to civic stability. The statute reflects a world in which a coastal commune needed rules not only for commerce and administration, but also for trust, succession, and the management of written authority itself. Among the most revealing parts of this legal world are the rules concerning wills. The statute recognized the right of a person to write a testament by hand, seal it, and place it in an approved location. That principle suggests a society in which written intention carried strong legal weight, provided that certain safeguards were met. A will had to include a clear date, and it also had to be protected from tampering, either through a recognizable seal or through deposit in one of several trusted religious or communal institutions. The chosen places were not random. They were centers of moral credibility, stability, and institutional memory. By entrusting wills to those locations, the city created a framework in which private desire could be transformed into publicly respected law. The last will was treated as something almost sacred, not merely because it concerned death, but because it represented the final, deliberate judgment of an individual whose property, family obligations, and memory would remain active after death. The countryside posed its own legal problems, and the statute dealt with those in a practical way. If a person from Zadar found himself outside the city, on an island or in a village within the district, and wished to make a will there, the law allowed it to be done before 4 witnesses. In that situation, testimony became the bridge between private speech and public record. After the testator's death, those witnesses were required to appear and truthfully report what had been said and ordered. If the court judged them reliable, an official document could then be drawn up and given the same force as a formally written testament. This was a legal culture that understood how fragile final intentions could become once a person died far from home. It responded by building a chain of validation around witnesses, court approval, and written confirmation. At the same time, the statute also drew a distinction between someone only temporarily away from Zadar and someone who permanently resided in the countryside. A temporary will made outside the city could lose force if the person survived and left that place. A permanent resident, however, could make a valid testament in the district, and that will remain effective even if death later came elsewhere. The rule is subtle, but it reveals a sophisticated concern with residence, continuity, and legal belonging. While urban law in Zadar was becoming more elaborate along the Adriatic coast, another transformation of great historical importance had taken place farther east in the Slavic world: the emergence of a new alphabet. During the 10th century, most likely in the Bulgarian cultural sphere, the script now known as Cyrillic began to replace the earlier Glagolitic writing system. This was not simply a technical change in handwriting. It marked a major stage in the shaping of Slavic literary culture. The new script adapted Greek letter forms to the sounds of the Slavic language and gradually became the dominant vehicle for writing across much of the Orthodox Slavic world. For a time, both systems coexisted. In some manuscripts, they even appeared side by side, a rare moment when two writing systems served the same language at once. Yet that balance did not last. The older alphabet slowly retreated, and the newer one spread more widely. This shift was not without debate. A learned monk known as a hrabber composed a defense of the Slavic letters at a time when their legitimacy still had to be argued. His concern was not merely which alphabet looked better on the page. The deeper issue was whether the Slavic language itself deserved full dignity as a sacred and literary medium. There were voices claiming that only a few ancient languages possessed true holiness, and that Slavic writing therefore lacked divine authority. Against that view, Krába insisted that the Slavic script had been created for a real spiritual purpose, and that it belonged within the history of Christian civilization. He tied its origin directly to Constantine, later known as Cyril, and to Methodius, presenting them as the true creators and translators who gave the Slavs written access to sacred teaching. His argument was powerful because it joined language, memory, and salvation into a single story. The point was not only that the Slavs had letters, it was that their letters came into being as part of God's unfolding order in human history. Krába's defense also reveals a confident awareness of cultural identity. He argues that while many Greeks could no longer clearly say who first created their letters or translated their books, Slavic learners knew exactly who had given them their script, and in what historical moment. This certainty mattered. It transformed the Slavic written tradition from something borrowed into something remembered as a founding act. In that telling, the creation of the alphabet was no accident of scholarship. It was a decisive event tied to rulers, missionaries, and the opening of a people to Christian knowledge. Even more striking is the irony that the work defending the older tradition survived only in manuscripts written in the newer script. That fact alone captures the speed and force of cultural change. A text composed to defend one writing system came down through history in another. The missionary vision behind this literary world can be seen even more vividly in the works of Clement, one of the disciples associated with the circle of Cyril and Methodius. After leaving Moravia and entering Bulgaria, Clement was sent to a frontier region where Christian teaching still needed to be rooted among ordinary people. His mission was not aimed only at elites or courts. It was directed at common believers, at communities recently absorbed into a larger political and religious order, and at populations who needed instruction in a language they could understand. That setting helps explain the character of his writings. Much of what survives from him belongs to the world of preaching, texts designed not for silent reading by scholars, but for oral delivery before congregations. His style combined clarity with elevated praise. He knew how to speak simply enough to be understood and yet powerfully enough to leave a lasting impression. This becomes especially clear in his eulogy for Cyril. In that work, Cyril is not presented merely as a learned translator or a historical figure of the recent past. He appears as a radiant spiritual guide, a new apostle whose work brought light into lands described as lying in ignorance and darkness. The imagery is deliberate and intense. Cyril shines like a heavenly light. He speaks with grace. He brings divine knowledge to a people previously cut off from it. He travels, teaches, translates, and leads others towards spiritual completeness. In this portrayal, the making of the alphabet and the translation of sacred texts become part of a much larger drama, the rescue of an entire people from blindness into understanding. The praise then becomes even more personal and devotional. One part of the sermon unfolds as a long blessing directed toward the body of the saint himself. His lips, tongue, face, eyes, hands, fingers, feet, soul, and resting place are all celebrated in turn. Each feature is linked to a spiritual gift bestowed upon the Slavic people. His tongue becomes the vehicle through which divine truth is spoken. His eyes overcome blindness. His hands bring down knowledge like rain on scorched hearts. His feet carry teaching across the world. The repetition creates rhythm, but it also does something more important. It turns memory into veneration. Cyril is no longer only a teacher from the past. He is a holy presence whose life is still active in the salvation of the people who hear his name. The sermon is carefully built to make that impression unforgettable. If sermons and legal statutes show the formal and intellectual life of medieval Eastern Europe, the birch bark letters reveal something even rarer: the texture of ordinary communication. Found in towns across the lands of Rus, these short, scratched messages preserve the voices of people handling everyday problems, obligations, quarrels, transactions, and appeals for help. They are usually brief, but their simplicity is precisely what makes them so valuable. These are not grand narratives, official proclamations, or solemn church texts. They are messages sent because someone had been arrested, a slave had been sold, a marriage had broken down, tribute had been seized, an artisan had been commissioned, or a profitable trade opportunity had appeared. One short note reports a killing and the possession of inheritance by others. Another records the trouble caused by the purchase of a slave woman in Pskov. The writer explains that he has been detained because of the affair and that companions have stood surety for him. He now needs information quickly so that he can defend himself at a hearing. Behind the few lines lies a larger world of trade, mobility, risk, and legal responsibility. People moved between towns. Slaves were bought and sold. A transaction in one place could lead to arrest in another. Court procedure depended on messages carried across distance, and the success of a defense might rest on whether another man answered in time. Another letter is much more personal. A son urges his parents to sell the farm and come to him, either to Smolensk or to Kiev, adding that grain is cheap there. In only a few lines, it opens a window onto family migration, economic calculation, and the movement of households across great distances. This is not the voice of a chronicler describing policy. It is the voice of someone rearranging life. Another message, written by a woman, carries the bitterness of abandonment. She says that what her father and relatives gave her is still in the hands of her former husband. He has now made an agreement with another woman, driven her away, and kept her property. She asks for help. The letter is painfully direct. It shows how marriage, dowry, kinship, support, and personal vulnerability all intersected in everyday life. Other letters turn to taxation, craftwork, and commerce. One writer complains that people failed to deliver tribute, and that outside forces have intervened to seize what had been collected. There is frustration, anxiety, and a warning to proceed carefully. Another message comes from a priest to an icon painter, asking him to paint 2 6-winged angels on small icons, and assuring him that payment can be settled. In another, 2 men write about squirrel skins, noting that they are selling well where they are, and urging immediate action if the furs have not yet been traded. They also mention that someone has wronged them and ask the recipient to come if he is free. These letters move effortlessly between trade and grievance, between business and personal networks. Nothing in them is ornamental. Every line exists because something practical is at stake. What makes these letters especially remarkable is how different they are from formal literary and religious works. A sermon seeks to persuade, elevate, and shape belief through careful rhetoric. A statute seeks to regulate, define, and stabilize public life through legal precision. The birch bark messages do neither. They are immediate, compressed, and often urgent. Their language belongs to action. They assume shared knowledge, familiar names, and existing relationships. Because of that, they expose aspects of life that formal texts often hide. Women trying to recover property, merchants managing risk, officials dealing with tribute, artisans receiving commissions, and families negotiating movement across wide territories. They show a society in motion, connected by trade routes, legal hearings, local power struggles, and household concerns. They also reveal problems that were especially characteristic of Rus's. One is the close link between long-distance trade and legal vulnerability. Another is the importance of tribute collection in frontier or peripheral regions. Another is the presence of slavery within ordinary transactions. These letters show that law in Rus's was not only something proclaimed by princes. It was something constantly activated by debt, sale, surety, inheritance, and obligation. They also show how wide the social geography of Rus's could be. A message scratched on bark might connect Pskov, Novgorod, Smolensk, Kiev, and the northern tribute zones in a single web of consequence. The distances were vast, but the communication was practical and direct. The spiritual self-understanding of Rus's appears in a far grander register in the work of Ilarion, a highly educated churchman of Kiev who composed a celebrated homily contrasting law and grace. His writing stands at an entirely different level from the birch bark letters, yet it belongs to the same broad world of Kievan Rus. In his vision, the conversion of the Rus was not an isolated political decision. It was part of sacred history itself. The movement from the Old Covenant to the New, from shadow to fulfillment, from law to grace, provided the framework within which the baptism of Rus's could be understood. That conversion was not, in his eyes, a local event on the edge of the Christian world. It was one stage in the universal spread of divine truth. At the center of this vision stood Vladimir, the ruler credited with bringing Christianity to Rus. Ilarion presents him not merely as a prince who made a wise political choice, but as a figure of world historical significance. He is compared to great rulers of the Christian past and placed in a line of providential action. In this telling, Rus's does not stand outside the Christian story, waiting to be included by others. It has already entered the heart of that story. The adoption of Christianity becomes evidence that divine grace has reached new peoples and new lands exactly as history was meant to unfold. By framing it this way, Ilarion gives Rus's a sacred place in the order of nations. This is also why his treatment of Vladimir carries such force. The prince is praised in language that moves beyond ordinary political memory. He appears as an instrument chosen for a higher work, almost in the manner of a saintly ruler. The comparison with Constantine is especially important, because it links the baptism of Rus to the great turning point of the Roman Christian Empire. Just as the older empire had once embraced the cross, so now Rus's had received it and carried it farther into the world. The message is not only that Rus is converted. The message is that Rus's inherited and extended the Christian mission. The earlier work of Byzantine emperors and holy rulers had not ended in Constantinople. It had continued northward. Across the medieval world, every land told its own story of faith through the memory of its teachers. Rome honored Peter and Paul, Asia remembered John, India looked to Thomas, and Egypt to Mark. In this shared pattern, each region claimed its place in the spread of belief by celebrating the figure who first brought light to its people. Within this wider tradition, the land of Rus also found its voice, raising praise for its own ruler, a man remembered not only for power and conquest, but for transformation. Vladimir, descended from a line of strong and renowned princes, was presented as the one who led his people out of darkness and into a new spiritual age. His ancestry was not forgotten. He stood in a line of rulers known for strength and courage, men whose reputations extended beyond their own borders. Yet his importance did not rest only on inherited glory. As he matured, he proved himself in action, establishing authority, subduing neighbouring lands and ruling with both force and calculation. Some territories were brought under control through negotiation, others through the sword. In this way, he secured his position and expanded his realm, becoming a figure both feared and respected. His rule was marked by order and discipline, but also by a growing awareness that something deeper lay beyond power alone. At a certain point, a shift took place that redefined his legacy entirely. The change was described not as a political maneuver, but as an awakening. He began to recognize the emptiness of idol worship and turned instead toward the search for a single, universal God. This was not presented as a gradual drift, but as a decisive moment of understanding. Reports of the Christian world to the south played a crucial role in this transformation. The Byzantine lands were described as places where faith shaped every aspect of life, where churches were filled, where prayer was constant, and where divine power was visible through signs and wonders. These accounts stirred something in him, creating a strong desire that could not be ignored. The decision that followed was both personal and political. He chose to embrace Christianity, and with that choice came the expectation that his entire land would follow. His baptism was described in symbolic language, as a rebirth, rather than a simple ritual. He cast aside his former identity, leaving behind the weight of past beliefs, and emerged renewed, clothed in a new spiritual identity. Even his name changed, linking him to a broader Christian world and marking his place within it. This moment was presented as a turning point not only for the ruler himself, but for the entire history of his people. From that point forward, his actions reflected a new mission. He ordered the mass baptism of his population, extending the new faith across every level of society. The command reached all groups without distinction, from the powerful to the humble, from the wealthy to the poor. Some accepted the change willingly, others out of fear of authority. But the result was the same. The land began to change, pagan practices were abandoned, sacred buildings were replaced, and a new religious structure took shape. Churches rose where idols once stood, and the symbols of the old belief system were dismantled. The transformation was presented as both physical and spiritual, a visible shift in the landscape as well as in the minds of the people. The language used to describe this moment is filled with contrast. Darkness gives way to light, confusion to clarity, silence to proclamation. The teachings of the gospel spread across cities, carried by clergy who now stood at the centre of public life. Religious ritual became a shared experience, drawing together communities in a common act of worship. Monasteries appeared in remote places, creating centres of devotion and learning. The sound of prayer, chant, and sacred words replaced the earlier noise of ritual tied to older beliefs. In this narrative, the entire land seems to awaken at once, moving from one state of existence into another. The ruler himself was praised not only as a political leader, but as a figure worthy of comparison with the great figures of Christian history. His role was set alongside that of an earlier emperor, who had transformed his own empire through faith. Just as that emperor had established a new religious order in his realm, Vladimir was described as doing the same in Rus. The comparison extended beyond simple admiration. It placed Rus's within a larger historical pattern, linking its transformation to earlier moments of conversion and renewal. Even his grandmother was drawn into this parallel, her earlier acceptance of Christianity seen as a foundation upon which his own actions were built. Through this lens, the conversion of Rusas was no longer an isolated event. It became part of a continuous chain, a movement of faith spreading across lands and generations. The ruler was no longer just a king. He became a central figure in a sacred story, one whose actions reshaped not only his kingdom, but its place in the wider world. Alongside these grand narratives, other texts approach the nature of human life and morality in a very different way. One story presents a simple yet powerful image: a blind man and a lame man placed together to guard a vineyard. Neither is complete on his own. One cannot see, the other cannot walk. Yet together they find a way to overcome their limitations. The blind man carries the lame man, who in turn provides direction. What begins as cooperation quickly turns into temptation. The two realize that the vineyard holds valuable fruit, and instead of guarding it, they decide to steal from it. Their plan is shaped by calculation rather than fear. They assume that they will not be discovered, and even if they are, they believe they can escape responsibility. Each one prepares an excuse, blaming his own weakness. The blind man will claim he could not see, the lame man that he could not move. In their minds, their limitations become tools for deception rather than barriers to wrongdoing. With this logic, they enter the vineyard and take what does not belong to them. The story then shifts from narrative to interpretation. The two figures are no longer just characters, but representations of deeper elements within human existence. The blind man becomes the body, driven by desire but lacking direction. The lame man represents the soul, capable of understanding but unable to act alone. Together, they form a complete human being, capable of both good and evil. Their cooperation mirrors the way in which thought and action combine in real life. When they act in harmony for the wrong purpose, the result is sin. The vineyard itself represents a space of trust, a place given into human care with clear boundaries. The theft of its fruit reflects the act of overstepping those boundaries, of taking what has not been granted. The story draws a parallel with earlier examples of disobedience, suggesting that the desire to reach beyond what is allowed has always been part of human nature. The fall is not caused by ignorance alone, but by a conscious decision to act, despite knowing the limits. The interpretation becomes more direct as it continues. The story is used to criticize those who seek power or authority without rightful claim. Just as the two men justify their actions through excuses, individuals in positions of responsibility may hide behind appearances while acting against the order they are meant to protect. The warning is clear. No position, no title, no outward sign of authority can protect someone from the consequences of wrongdoing. The same pattern repeats throughout history, where ambition and desire lead individuals to misuse power, believing they can avoid accountability. The conclusion reinforces this idea through judgment. The lord of the vineyard eventually discovers what has happened and responds by removing both men from their positions. Their excuses fail, and their actions are exposed. The message is not subtle. Responsibility cannot be divided or avoided. The body and the soul act together, and together they bear the consequences. The story serves as a reflection on human nature, reminding the listener that weakness is not an excuse for wrongdoing, and that awareness without discipline leads to failure. While such allegorical stories explored moral questions, other texts, turned their attention to the origins of entire peoples. One account traces the beginnings of the Slavs, back to a moment of division among nations, placing them within a broader story of human dispersal. According to this narrative, the Slavs emerged from a lineage that spread across northern and western lands, eventually settling near the Danube. From there, groups began to move outward, forming new communities and taking names based on the regions they inhabited. As these groups spread, they adapted to different environments and developed distinct identities. Some settled along major rivers, others in forests or near lakes. Their names reflected these landscapes, tying identity directly to geography. Over time, these communities became known as separate tribes, each with its own customs and traditions. The story emphasizes both unity and division. All belong to a common origin, yet each develops in its own direction. External pressures played a role in this movement. Attacks from neighboring peoples forced some groups to migrate further, seeking safety in new territories. These movements reshaped the distribution of populations, creating new centers of settlement. The narrative presents this process as both reactive and natural, a response to conflict as well as an expression of expansion. The description of customs reveals a sharp contrast between different groups. Some are portrayed as orderly and respectful, maintaining structured family relations and established traditions. Others are depicted as living in a more chaotic manner, lacking formal marriage practices and engaging in behavior described as uncivilized. These contrasting images serve a purpose. They create a moral hierarchy, distinguishing between those who follow a recognized order and those who exist outside it. Ritual practices also differ widely. Some groups follow structured ceremonies and maintain clear social roles, while others rely on gatherings and informal unions. Funeral customs vary as well, with some communities practicing cremation and others observing different rites. These details highlight the diversity within the broader Slavic world, showing that shared origin does not lead to uniform culture. The story also introduces powerful external groups that influence the region. Some imposed control, others passed through, leaving behind traces of conflict and change. These encounters shaped the development of the Slavic communities, forcing adaptation and sometimes leading to the disappearance of entire groups. The narrative preserves these moments as part of a collective memory, linking identity to both internal tradition and external challenge. In another tradition, the focus shifts from origins to leadership, presenting a legendary ruler whose story blends history and imagination. After the death of a powerful leader, a city rises in his memory, becoming a symbol of continuity. His daughter is chosen to rule, not because of inheritance alone, but because of her exceptional qualities. She is described as surpassing others in wisdom, presence, and the ability to command respect. The story emphasizes qualities beyond physical strength. Authority is linked to wisdom, restraint, and a kind of presence that commands obedience without force. The ruler is not only a defender of the land, but a figure who embodies its identity. Her choice to remain unmarried and without heirs adds another layer to the narrative. It suggests a dedication to rule that places the stability of the land above personal legacy. Yet, it also introduces a consequence. Without succession, the continuity of power becomes uncertain, and the strength of the realm begins to fade after her death. Finally, another account presents a moment of diplomatic encounter between rulers, offering a glimpse into the ceremonial side of medieval politics. A king, newly established in his authority, seeks to strengthen ties with a neighbouring ruler. Messengers are sent, and arrangements are made for a meeting at the border. The gathering is not merely political. It is carefully staged, combining religious ritual, public display, and symbolic gestures. When the two leaders meet, They exchange signs of peace and enter a sacred space together. The setting reinforces the idea that political agreements are bound to religious authority. The ceremony that follows blends governance and faith with prayer, procession, and public affirmation. The king appears in full regalia, distinguished among those present, while clergy conduct the ritual with precision and formality. The agreement is sealed through shared participation in sacred rites, followed by a period of celebration. Feasting, music, and exchange of gifts reinforce the bond between the two sides. The event lasts for days, turning diplomacy into a public spectacle that involves not only rulers but their followers as well. By the time the gathering ends, the agreement has been strengthened through both ritual and social connection. In the medieval world, travel was not only a physical journey, but also a way of collecting stories, impressions, and fragments of distant lives. One such account describes a long route stretching from the western edge of Europe deep into the heart of the eastern lands and back again. The narrative unfolds as a sequence of stops, each measured in days of travel, each marked by a place and its people. It follows a steady rhythm, moving from one location to another, offering glimpses into communities along the way. These entries often focus on Jewish life, noting the number of inhabitants, their leaders, and the structure of their society. Yet the account does not rely entirely on first-hand observation. It reflects layers of retelling, additions, and reshaping over time, blending travel memory with second-hand knowledge and imagination. During a passage through central Greece, the narrative pauses at a settlement near the foot of rugged mountains. A small Jewish community is noted there, its size modest, its leadership briefly mentioned. The focus quickly shifts away from them to a different group altogether, the people living high in the surrounding mountains. These inhabitants are portrayed as elusive and swift, moving with remarkable speed across difficult terrain. Their lifestyle is described as one shaped by the landscape itself. From their elevated strongholds, they descend suddenly into the valleys, carrying out raids before retreating back into the heights where few can follow. Their independence stands out. No ruler is said to control them, no authority to command their obedience. Their mountain environment acts as a natural defense, making any direct confrontation nearly impossible. Attempts to subdue them are described as futile, not because of their numbers, but because of the terrain they inhabit, and their ability to move through it with ease. They appear almost untouchable, beyond the reach of conventional power. What makes their portrayal even more striking is the ambiguity surrounding their identity. They are said to adopt names associated with Jewish tradition and to refer to Jewish communities as their kin. Yet their behaviour contradicts any simple classification. They are depicted as raiders who attack and plunder, showing restraint only in limited circumstances. While they are described as sparing certain groups from death, they do not hesitate to steal from them. Their relationship with religion is equally uncertain. They are not seen as followers of the dominant Christian faith, but neither are they fully integrated into any established religious system. Instead, they exist on the margins, adopting elements of identity without fully belonging to any one tradition. The tone of this account suggests that much of this description may have been shaped by hearsay. The image of mountain raiders descending like wild animals appears in multiple contexts across different regions, often used to describe groups living beyond settled society. It reflects a pattern of storytelling in which unfamiliar communities are framed through comparison and repetition. Rather than a precise record, the description becomes a constructed image, shaped by the expectations and assumptions of those who recorded it. A different perspective on similar groups appears in accounts of rebellion further north, where mountainous terrain once again plays a crucial role. Here, the focus shifts to a large-scale uprising against imperial authority. The origins of this revolt are tied to a mixture of political tension and personal grievance. A ruler's actions, perceived as unjust or dismissive, spark resentment among local leaders. What begins as a request for recognition and reward turns into open defiance when that request is denied. The leaders of the rebellion emerge as determined and forceful figures, capable of rallying support despite initial hesitation among their followers. They understand that fear must be replaced with conviction. To achieve this, they turn to powerful symbols and shared belief. A place of worship is established, not merely as a religious centre, but as a focal point for unity and purpose. Through dramatic displays and intense emotional expression, they convince others that their cause is justified, and even supported by divine will. Once the rebellion takes hold, its momentum builds quickly. The landscape once again becomes a decisive factor. Fortresses perched on steep heights provide secure bases, while narrow passes and hidden routes offer strategic advantages. The rebels use these features to their full potential, avoiding direct confrontation when it does not suit them, and striking when conditions are favourable. Their tactics rely on mobility, surprise, and deep knowledge of the terrain. They do not seek to hold ground in the conventional sense, but to control movement and disrupt their opponents. Their success is reinforced by alliances. Forces from beyond the region join them, adding strength and unpredictability to their campaigns. With this support, they expand their reach, moving beyond defense into active offensives. Towns are attacked, resources seized, and populations displaced. The conflict spreads, drawing in larger powers and reshaping the political landscape. From the perspective of those opposing them, these rebels are often described in harsh terms, their actions framed as destructive and unlawful. Their leaders are portrayed as impulsive, driven by ambition and defiance. Yet beneath this portrayal lies an acknowledgement of their effectiveness. Their ability to challenge a powerful empire and maintain control over difficult terrain speaks to a level of organisation and resilience that cannot be ignored. Elsewhere, another kind of encounter unfolds, one not defined by open conflict, but by submission and negotiation. A regional ruler, facing the overwhelming force of a larger power, chooses a different path. Instead of continuing resistance, he seeks forgiveness and presents himself in a manner designed to demonstrate humility. His appearance is carefully constructed to convey submission. Barefoot, unarmed, and marked by symbols of surrender, he approaches the opposing ruler not as an equal, but as someone seeking mercy. This act is both personal and political. It signals the end of one phase of conflict and the beginning of another kind of relationship. The response from the dominant ruler reflects an understanding of this shift. Mercy is granted, not only as an act of compassion, but as a strategic decision. By accepting submission, authority is reinforced, without the need for further destruction. The defeated ruler is not removed, but incorporated, becoming part of a new order under the control of the victor. Such moments reveal the complexity of power in this period. Victory is not always measured by destruction alone. The ability to transform an enemy into an ally, or at least into a subordinate, can be equally valuable. The ritual of submission becomes a language through which political realities are communicated and redefined. At the same time, spiritual transformation plays a role in shaping leadership. One account describes a ruler who, after years of governing and expanding his realm, turns away from worldly power. His decision is presented not as a retreat, but as a fulfillment of a deeper purpose. Having secured his lands and established order, he begins to see the limits of earthly achievement. Wealth, authority, and glory are described as temporary, unable to endure beyond death. In a gathering of his followers and family, he speaks openly about this realization. He reminds them of the struggles that shaped the land, the efforts made to bring stability, and the importance of maintaining both faith and unity. His words are not only a farewell, but a set of instructions for the future. He emphasizes the need for justice, for adherence to belief, and for care toward both the powerful and the humble. The transfer of power is handled with careful attention. A successor is chosen and presented not simply as an heir, but as someone entrusted with responsibility. Guidance is given on how to rule, how to protect the community, and how to maintain balance. Authority is passed on with both blessing and expectation, ensuring continuity while marking a clear transition. The ruler's departure from power is accompanied by a personal transformation. He abandons his former status and enters a life defined by spiritual discipline. This change is not portrayed as a loss, but as a gain, a movement towards something more lasting than temporal authority. His example reinforces the idea that leadership is not only about governing others, but also about understanding one's place within a larger order. Meanwhile, in the wider political landscape, communication between distant powers continues through letters and envoys. One ruler seeks recognition from a spiritual authority far beyond his own borders. In doing so, he aims to strengthen his position, gaining legitimacy that extends beyond military success. The exchange is formal and respectful, filled with expressions of loyalty and gratitude. Titles and honours are carefully acknowledged, reinforcing a sense of shared purpose. At the same time, the letter reveals underlying tensions. The ruler speaks of conflicts with neighbouring powers, presenting himself as unjustly attacked, while emphasising his own restraint. He asks for intervention, hoping that authority from afar can influence events closer to home. This appeal highlights the interconnected nature of power, where religious and political authority overlap and reinforce one another. Gifts accompany the message, symbols of goodwill and recognition. They serve both as tokens of respect and as reminders of the relationship being established. The exchange is not purely symbolic. It reflects a strategic effort to position oneself within a broader network of influence, balancing local power with external validation. In the aftermath of conquest and shifting alliances, new conflicts arise. Armies move across territories, sieges are laid, and battles fought. In one such confrontation, overconfidence proves costly. Forces that underestimate their opponents are caught off guard and defeated. The outcome is swift and decisive, leading to the capture or loss of key leaders. The defeat is interpreted not only in military terms, but as a consequence of moral failure. Pride and internal division are seen as contributing factors, weakening the cohesion needed for success. Following such a loss, leadership must be re-established. New figures rise to fill the gap, and strategies shift in response to changing conditions. Alliances are reconsidered, sometimes leading to unexpected partnerships. Marriage becomes one such tool used to secure peace and strengthen ties between former enemies. These unions are not merely personal, but carry significant political weight, linking families, territories, and interests. The ceremonies surrounding such arrangements are elaborate, emphasizing wealth, status, and mutual respect. The exchange of gifts and the display of resources serve to reinforce the legitimacy of the agreement. Through these acts, conflict is transformed into cooperation, at least temporarily, as both sides seek stability in a volatile environment. In another case, diplomacy takes on a more personal form. A regional leader seeks the support of a powerful ruler by offering loyalty and requesting a marriage alliance. His approach combines humility with confidence, acknowledging the authority of the other while emphasizing his own resources and status. The request is carefully framed, presenting the alliance as beneficial to both sides. The response is shaped by counsel from advisors who recognize the strategic value of the proposal. By accepting, the ruler gains a loyal supporter and extends influence into new territories. The alliance is sealed through marriage, accompanied by ceremonies and mutual recognition. The relationship that follows is one of cooperation, with the new ally integrated into a broader political framework. Yet even within this partnership, differences remain. Cultural and linguistic barriers are acknowledged, requiring adaptation and understanding. Advice is given on how to navigate these differences, emphasizing patience, respect, and the importance of maintaining one's identity while adapting to new circumstances. The success of the alliance depends not only on formal agreements, but on the ability to manage these human elements. In the first half of the 13th century, the balance of power in the Balkans shifted dramatically, and one battle stood above all others in marking that change. John II, Asen's victory near Klokotnitsa, did far more than defeat a rival army. It broke the power of Thessaloniki, shattered Epirote ambitions, and placed Bulgaria at the centre of Balkan politics. From that moment on, John Asen no longer appeared as a regional ruler, defending his borders. He emerged as a sovereign, with claims stretching across nearly the entire peninsula, ruling from one sea to another, and presenting himself as the dominant force between Constantinople, Serbia, Epirus, and the Latin states. The image he chose to project after that victory was no accident. In the monumental inscription connected with his church foundation at Tarnovo, he speaks with the confidence of a ruler who believes his success has been granted by divine favour. He presents himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a pious emperor whose achievements were made possible through heavenly support. The church itself becomes part of the message. It is both a religious offering and a political statement, a sacred monument built to turn military triumph into permanent memory. The victory is framed as an act of faith as much as one of war. By linking conquest to devotion, he shapes the ideal image of rulership: strong in battle, protected by God, generous toward the church, and fully entitled to command. His description of the lands brought under his authority is especially revealing. He does not speak only of one enemy or one captured city. He lists a broad zone stretching from Adrianople to the western coast, including Greek, Serbian, and Albanian territories. In doing so, he is not just naming places. He is defining a world over which he claims supremacy. Adrianople matters in this vision because it stood as one of the key gateways of Thrace, a city with enormous strategic and symbolic value. To mention it is to show that his influence had moved deep into lands once firmly tied to the Byzantine orbit, and later contested by the Latins. It signals control not at the margins, but near the heart of the struggle for the peninsula. Even more striking is the way he speaks of the lands around Constantinople itself. He suggests that the Frankish rulers there survived only because he allowed it, and that they had no emperor above him. This is more than boastful language. It shows how he understood his position after the battle. He was not content with describing himself as victorious over Theodore alone. He wanted to present himself as the one figure before whom all others in the region had to reckon. In that sense, his inscription offers a vision of rulership built on three pillars at once: divine approval, military domination, and political centrality. This new prestige had consequences far beyond propaganda. The victory opened the way for Bulgarian expansion into lands previously controlled by Epirus and Thessaloniki. It also transformed Bulgaria into a direct threat to the Latin Empire. Cities in Thrace began to turn toward John Asen, opening their gates to him and accepting his authority. Religious policy followed political conquest. Clergy associated with the Latin Church were replaced, and Bulgarian influence spread not only through soldiers and governors, but through bishops and priests. Control over territory was matched by control over worship, ecclesiastical order, and religious allegiance. In this way, conquest was turned into a program of integration. At the same time, John Arsen's position gave him leverage in the larger struggle between Latin Constantinople and Nicaea. His contacts with the Patriarch and Emperor in Nicaea were not simply acts of piety or diplomacy in isolation. They were part of a broader strategy. By moving back toward orthodoxy and seeking recognition for the Church of Tarnovo at the highest level, he strengthened the legitimacy of his state while also placing himself within the contest over who would inherit the Byzantine world. Bulgaria was no longer an outsider pressing from the margins. It had become a decisive player in the fate of the Eastern Empire's former lands. Yet while Bulgaria under John Arsen was rising toward the height of its power, the world around it remained unstable, violent, and deeply fragmented. Further south and west, the Byzantine successor states were struggling to contain rebellions, defend shrinking possessions, and respond to enemies on multiple fronts. One account of the campaigns of the 1250s reveals how fragile that situation had become. Imperial commanders moved through Macedonia with forces that were too small and too weak for the tasks before them. Raiding replaced real conquest. Instead of launching bold offensives, they plundered the countryside, seized animals, and tried to sustain authority through movement and intimidation, rather than secure military control. It was in this setting that the Serbs struck with great effect. Their advance was not presented as an isolated raid, but as part of a larger unravelling of Byzantine power in the west. Once imperial weakness became visible, neighbouring rulers moved quickly to exploit it. The Serbian forces crossed into contested lands, plundered widely, and encountered little organised resistance. The local Byzantine commander proved disastrously unprepared. He lacked intelligence, failed to scout the enemy properly, and did not know how to arrange his men in a disciplined battle line. Instead of directing a coordinated defence, he allowed his soldiers to rush forward without order. The result was exactly what might be expected in such circumstances. A scattered force was overwhelmed by a more numerous enemy. Many were killed or captured, and those who survived fled in panic. In this telling, the Byzantine defeat was not blamed on fate alone or even on Serbian strength by itself. It was caused by incompetence, disorder, and poor leadership. The enemy succeeded because the defenders failed at the most basic level of command. This is crucial to the tone of the narrative. The disaster is not described as an honourable defeat against impossible odds. It is presented as a humiliation made worse by the inadequacy of those entrusted with defence. Once the field army collapsed, places like Prilep were left isolated, cut off, and trapped, their garrisons reduced to passive survival. The Serbian role in this moment reflects a wider pattern in Balkan politics. As Byzantine authority weakened, Serbia was no longer merely a frontier principality reacting to larger empires. It was becoming an assertive regional force, ready to raid, conquer, and intervene whenever opportunities appeared. Military power in the Balkans was no longer concentrated in one imperial centre. It was distributed among ambitious rulers, who watched one another closely and moved fast when the balance shifted. Bulgaria, too, soon entered a period of uncertainty despite the great prestige won under John Arsen. After the death of one ruler, the country was pulled into a chain of murders, shifting loyalties, and hurried attempts to secure legitimacy. One king was struck down through intrigue. His killer hoped to take control, even marrying the widow in order to strengthen his claim, but he himself was soon hunted down and killed. In the middle of this disorder, outside forces entered the scene. A powerful relative from the north arrived with an army and took away his daughter, who had been connected by marriage to the dead ruler. The picture that emerges is one of a throne exposed to violence, faction, and sudden reversals. What mattered in that moment was not only strength, but the appearance of lawful right. The Bulgarian leading men, faced with the lack of a clear heir, chose a new ruler not simply because he was available, but because he could be fitted into a dynastic framework. That is why marriage became so important. By arranging for him to marry a woman descended from the earlier royal line, they sought to wrap political necessity in the language of inheritance and continuity. It was not enough for a man to rule, he had to seem meant to rule. Blood, marriage, and association with an earlier dynasty were used to make a fresh claim look old, rightful, and stable. This reveals a great deal about the political culture of the period. Rule in the Balkans was rarely secure on force alone. Armies could win battles and seize capitals, but legitimacy required something more durable. It had to be performed, displayed, and attached to lineage, church approval, and marriage alliances. A new ruler needed not only soldiers behind him, but symbols around him that made obedience seem natural. In Bulgaria's case, that meant turning to a bride whose ancestry could bridge the gap between political convenience and dynastic memory. The Byzantine observer looking at this situation saw it as evidence of Bulgaria's instability, but also of its continuing importance. Even amid internal chaos, Bulgaria remained too significant to ignore. Peace with it mattered. Marriage into its ruling circle mattered. Every succession crisis there affected the wider balance between Nicaea, Serbia, Epirus, and the Latin world. The throne of Tarnovo was not a local affair, it was a pivot in Balkan politics. In the Eastern Islamic world, one of the most important voices on the Mongol expansion came from a man born into privilege, administration, and scholarship. He belonged to a powerful family from Khorasan, a family long connected to high office under earlier Muslim dynasties. By the time the Mongols had destroyed Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, his own relatives had risen within the new order. His brother became one of the most important officials of the Ilkhanid state, while he himself was later appointed governor of Baghdad. But before holding power in that shattered city, he had already begun shaping one of the major historical narratives of the Mongol age. His account was not written from the position of an outsider trying to guess the meaning of events. He had travelled to the Mongol capital in the early 1250s and spent significant time there, close enough to gather information about the great assemblies, the inner workings of power, and the thinking of the ruling elite. His writing often praised Mongol strength and success, yet it was not simple admiration. There is distance in his tone and at times even irony. Still, his broader interpretation was guided by a religious vision. He saw the Mongols not merely as conquerors, but as instruments of divine punishment, riders unleashed upon a corrupt world. In that view, their destruction of Muslim lands could be understood as chastisement for rebellion and failure, while their victories over non-Muslim peoples became part of a larger sacred design. When he turns to the great gathering held under Ögedei, the picture is one of ceremony, family hierarchy, military planning, and imperial confidence. The ruler appears as a sovereign at ease after earlier victories, seated in triumph, with commanders returning from distant campaigns and princes summoned from across the empire. The assembly is presented not as a hurried war council, but as an event of enormous scale and prestige, combining celebration with administration. First came the honours, the feasting, the public display of imperial generosity, and the reaffirmation of rank within the ruling house. For an entire month, the imperial family and commanders are described as living in abundance, surrounded by luxury, cupbearers, and courtly pleasure. The scene is carefully staged to show that power in the Mongol world rested not only on conquest, but also on order, ritual, distribution, and the visible abundance of the ruling centre. Only after this long period of ceremony did the gathering turn towards state business. That transition is important. It shows that the Mongol Empire was not simply a machine of war driven by instinct or chaos. Decisions were made through consultation among princes, commanders, and close relatives of the ruling house. Campaigns were not improvised at the edge of battle, but planned through assemblies in which old rules and new decrees were confirmed, resources distributed, and responsibilities assigned. The empire appears here as highly organized, structured around kinship, obligation, and the careful direction of armies toward specific frontiers. The Western campaign emerged from this process as one of the major priorities of the empire. In the account, the reason given is clear. Several peoples to the west had not yet been fully subdued. The lands of the steppe, the Volga region, the Caucasian fringe, and the Slavic territories beyond them still contained communities that had resisted or escaped full incorporation into Mongol authority. This was not presented as a distant curiosity. It was described as unfinished work, a problem requiring decisive action. The peoples mentioned were not merely neighbours. They were rebels, survivors, and obstacles to the completion of empire. Particular emphasis fell on the peoples of the Western steppe and beyond it. The Cumans and the Hungarians were singled out as targets, not yet completely broken. The Western campaign, therefore, had a double purpose. It aimed, first at conquest and destruction, at the crushing of resistance and the extension of imperial power across lands that had so far remained outside full control. But it also aimed at finishing what previous campaigns had begun, clearing the frontier and bringing all remaining hostile regions into submission. The princes assigned to this task were among the most important men of the dynasty. Batu took the lead, joined by other grandsons and sons of the ruling line, as well as major commanders of proven reputation. This alone reveals the weight the Mongol leadership placed on the expedition. It was not a side campaign. It was one of the empire's great enterprises. The armies gathered for this push westward were not drawn from a single people. The account makes clear that the forces included Turks, Iranian-speaking groups, and the many military elements already folded into Mongol command. This again points to the empire's remarkable organizational capacity. The Mongols did not conquer only through their own original tribal base. They drew manpower from across their domains, directing a vast multinational military system through the leadership of princes and elite commanders. Orders moved outward from the center. Armies gathered in separate encampments, then advanced according to a shared timetable. By spring, the plan set at the assembly was already in motion. The first great blow fell on the Volga Bulgars. Their land stood at a crucial point between the steppe, the forest zone, and the river trade routes of the north. The city of Bulgar was famed for strength, wealth, and commercial importance, especially in the long-distance exchange of furs and other goods. To strike there first was both practical and symbolic. It secured the approach to the western and northwestern lands, while also sending a warning to every other people in the region. The description of the Mongol armies assembling there emphasizes scale above all else. The earth is said to tremble beneath them, the noise alone enough to astonish animals. The point is unmistakable. These armies were meant to appear overwhelming, unstoppable, and terrifying before battle had even begun. Once they attacked, the pattern was ruthless and efficient. The city was stormed, its population killed or enslaved, and the conquest deliberately turned into an example for others. The Western campaign, then, was not merely about occupying land. It was about demonstrating what resistance would bring. Slaughter, captivity, and destruction became part of imperial strategy. Terror was not a side effect of conquest. It was one of its instruments. A very different perspective appears in the Rus account of the invasion that soon followed. There, the Mongols are not described from the inner circles of empire, but from the viewpoint of those who faced them as a catastrophe descending without mercy. The chronicler presents their arrival as sudden and overwhelming, like a plague of locusts. They enter the land of Ryazan in immense numbers, take one place after another, and send demands that reveal both their confidence and their method. They ask for a tenth of everything: people, princes, horses, wealth. The demand itself is striking. It combines tribute, submission, and humiliation. The rulers of Ryazan refuse, answering that only when they are all dead will everything belong to the invaders. This response is defiant, but the narrative quickly reveals a deeper weakness among the Rus' princes. Help is requested from Vladimir, but no effective unity follows. One prince refuses to join the others properly, preferring separate action. That failure of coordination stands at the heart of the tragedy. The Mongols win quickly not only because of their numbers and mobility, but because the Rus lands are divided, their rulers unable or unwilling to act together in time. The invaders exploit this weakness mercilessly. The siege of Ryazan is brutal and total. Once the city falls, the chronicler dwells not on military detail alone, but on massacre, fire, rape, and the destruction of the whole urban community. Prince, princess, clergy, women, children, monks, and nuns all perish in horror. The bishop survives only because he had left just before the siege tightened. The emotional force of the account is intense. It is not simply a record of conquest. It is a lament over the collapse of a Christian world under violent pagan assault. From there, the Mongols move with astonishing speed. Vladimir is threatened, its ruler flees, and the people shut themselves inside, taking refuge in the cathedral as the city burns around them. Again, the fall is described through fire, enclosure, and sacred death. The church becomes a tomb. Those inside take monastic vows as destruction closes in, turning their final moments into an act of spiritual preparation. Yet holiness does not save the city from burning, nor does prayer stop the invaders. The chronicler does not hide this. Instead, he turns to explanation through sin. The Mongols are terrible, but their victories are possible because God has allowed punishment to fall upon Ruses. This religious interpretation runs throughout the account. The Mongols obtain so many victories so quickly because the land is divided, the princes quarrel, and the people have sinned. Internecine hatred, greed, and failure to repent have invited divine wrath. Foreign conquest becomes a scourge sent to humble a corrupt people. In that sense, the chronicler's interpretation is not entirely unlike the Muslim historians. Both see the Mongols as instruments of judgment. The difference lies in perspective. One writes from within the empire that uses them. The other writes from among the ruined. At the same time, the Rus account reveals much about Mongol tactics. They move fast, besiege cities efficiently, and coordinate attacks across wide distances. They send emissaries first, demanding submission and tribute. They strike where resistance is divided. They rely on mobility and relentless advance, taking one city and then immediately pressing on to the next. They overwhelm patrols, pursue fleeing princes, and combine encirclement with terror. In the narrative, they are everywhere at once. At Ryazan, Kolomna, Vladimir, Moscow, Suzdal, Tver, and finally Torjok. Their campaign is not a slow crawl. It is a sweeping chain of destruction. The account of Torjok brings the Mongols frighteningly close to Novgorod. The city expects the worst. Help does not arrive in time, and Torjok too falls after a determined defense. The road ahead seems open. The chronicler says the invaders advance to within roughly 100 versts of Novgorod, cutting down all before them. Yet then, they turned away. The text explains Novgorod's escape not by strategy or geography, but by divine protection. The prayers of saints, clergy, rulers, monks, and the great church of holy wisdom are said to have preserved it. The chronicler sees the city's survival as an act of grace. Historians may point to terrain, weather, supply, distance, and the practical limits of campaigning in the north. But within the narrative itself, the answer is spiritual. Novgorod was spared because heaven intervened. The Hungarian experience of the Mongol invasion reveals the same enemy in yet another light. There, too, the first reaction is disbelief. Rumours of the Tatars had circulated for years, but many dismissed them as exaggeration or fantasy. Confidence in the strength of the kingdom, combined with delay and indecision, prevented a timely response. Even when the danger became undeniable, argument and hesitation paralysed the leadership. Some wanted caution and avoidance. Others believed sheer numbers would scatter the enemy at first sight. No common plan emerged soon enough. This failure, in the eyes of the chronicler, was one of the main reasons disaster followed. King Bela did make preparations. He inspected the eastern frontier, ordered forests cut down, and had barricades built across the easier entry routes through the mountains. On paper, this was sensible defence. In practice, it proved almost useless. The Mongols sent specialised advance units equipped for just such work. Tens of thousands moved ahead with axes, clearing roads, cutting through barriers, and opening the passes. The defences that had seemed solid to the Hungarians were torn apart like straw. This is one of the most revealing moments in the whole description. The Mongols were an unusual enemy because they could turn engineering, speed, discipline, and preparation into offensive advantages at a scale their opponents had not imagined. They were not simply raiders from afar. They were a military machine that could adapt the landscape itself to invasion. The battle that followed near Muhi shows Mongol method at its most devastating. Instead of rushing directly into hand-to-hand combat, they began with cavalry probes, teasing the enemy and drawing them forward. Their riders appeared, challenged, and then withdrew while firing arrows, exactly as they had been trained to do. The Hungarians mistook this movement for weakness and believed the enemy was retreating. In reality, they were being led toward a carefully chosen position near the river, where the main Mongol force waited concealed. The Hungarian camp, once established, became a trap. Tents were packed too tightly, movement inside became nearly impossible, and the wagons and shields around the perimeter created the illusion of defense while also obstructing escape. The Mongols attacked in stages. They contested the bridge, absorbed an initial setback, then returned with siege engines to drive off the guards and secure the crossing. Others forded the river elsewhere. By dawn, they had spread across the plain and surrounded the camp. This was not a simple frontal battle. It was a coordinated operation combining deception, engineering, archery, encirclement, and psychological pressure. At first light, a few Hungarian leaders fought with great courage. Koloman, Agrinus, and the Templar commander charged repeatedly and inflicted real damage. But bravery could not overcome the scale and structure of the Mongol attack. More and more enemy forces appeared, like locusts rising from the earth, until the camp was ringed on all sides. Then came the decisive phase. Arrows, fire, confusion, and panic. The Mongols did not need to storm every position directly. They compressed the Hungarians, exhausted them, and then opened what seemed like a path of escape. This too was deliberate. As the Hungarians fled through the gap, Mongol units shadowed them on both sides, waiting until fatigue broke all order. Only then did they begin the slaughter in earnest, raining missiles and cutting down the fugitives until marshland and river finished what the blades began. Thomas the Archdeacon's explanation for the defeat, therefore, has several layers. He blames delay, pride, argument, and lack of discipline among the Hungarians. He is especially critical of the inability of the kingdom's leaders to agree on a strategy before the enemy arrived. But he also recognizes Mongol superiority in method. They won through preparation, mobility, deception, archery, engineering, discipline, and the ability to turn every stage of battle into an advantage. The Mongols were unusual because they did not fight, as the Hungarians expected a Christian or Western enemy to fight. They did not seek honourable close combat at the outset. They tested, lured, surrounded, harassed, and broke their enemies from a distance before moving in for destruction. He also suggests that divine judgment lay behind the disaster. The comparison of the Mongols to locusts and the citation of sacred language point in that direction. In his eyes, the invasion was not merely a military failure, it was a calamity permitted by God. That helps explain another question that haunted contemporaries. Why no Christian prince came to rescue Hungary? The answer lies partly in politics, distance, and the sheer speed of the invasion. No neighbouring ruler could gather forces quickly enough to stop what had already broken through the passes and smashed the royal army. But within the moral logic of the narrative, isolation itself becomes part of the punishment. Hungary faced the storm largely alone because the judgment had already fallen. Another witness to this catastrophe, Roger of Torre Maggiore, saw the invasion at much closer range and later described it in deeply personal terms. An Italian churchman who had come to Hungary with a papal legate, he had entered the ecclesiastical world of the kingdom and was there when the Mongols struck in full force. He watched cities fall, fled through ruined regions, and found refuge only briefly before falling into Mongol hands himself. He escaped only during the withdrawal and later wrote his account as a lament for the destruction of Hungary. That perspective is essential. His narrative did not emerge from distant rumour or court memory alone, but from movement through devastation, from direct fear, and from survival among ruins. For Roger, the Mongols were both monstrous and brilliant. He saw them as savage destroyers. Yet, he could not deny their skill. Like Thomas, he was struck by their resilience, cunning, and strange methods of war. He described their weapons and armour in detail, not as curiosities, but as part of understanding how this enemy had overcome a kingdom. He had seen enough to know that traditional expectations of battle no longer held. These were not enemies who fought by the rules Western clerics or nobles were used to imagining. Their advance combined terror with order, brutality with precision. Taken together, these accounts from Persia, Rus, and Hungary reveal the Mongol world campaign from radically different angles, yet with striking points of overlap. The Persian historian shows an empire capable of summoning princes from across Eurasia, holding great assemblies, confirming laws, assigning armies by region, and launching vast, coordinated invasions. The Rus's chronicler shows the speed and horror of those invasions as they fell on divided principalities unable to unite. The Hungarian writer shows how even a large and wealthy kingdom could be broken when its leaders hesitated, and its armies faced an enemy unlike any they had known before. And the witness from within ruined Hungary confirms the depth of that shock from the level of lived experience. In all of them, the Mongols appear as more than a single army on the march. They appear as a system. They could plan at the highest level, gather forces from many peoples, clear mountain barriers, test enemy reactions, conceal large formations, cross rivers under pressure, encircle camps, manipulate retreat, and turn flight into massacre. Their victories came fast not because they relied on chaos, but because they mastered organization, timing, and fear. That is why these writers, despite their differences, keep reaching for larger explanations. Some call the Mongols rebels destroyers, others instruments of God's wrath, others a plague loosed upon sinful lands. None of them sees the invasion as ordinary war. It felt too sudden, too vast, too destructive, and too complete. Cities famous for strength fell in days. Princes died fleeing through rivers and forests. Armies vanished in marshes and flames. great kingdoms found themselves fighting an enemy that could cut roads through mountains, cross borders like wind, and turn whole regions into silence. In the wake of the Mongol invasion, entire regions of Eastern and Central Europe were left exposed, shattered, and deeply uncertain. Some cities were erased in fire, others survived only as frightened shells, and even those who escaped the first wave often found that safety was only an illusion. Among the most vivid descriptions of that devastation is the account of the fall of Oradea, where panic, false hope, and relentless violence combined into one of the most horrifying episodes of the campaign. After taking the mining town of Rodna and capturing its leading count, Kaadan pushed onward with speed and precision. He selected several hundred armed Germans from among the local settlers and forced them to guide his army through forests, ravines, rock passages, and mountain routes until they reached Oradea. That city was one of the best-known places in the Hungarian kingdom, and news of the invasion had driven many people there in search of protection. Nobles, clergy, women of high rank, servants, peasants, and refugees had all crowded into the city, believing its reputation and defences might save them. Yet fear was already spreading before the enemy even appeared. Repairs had been made to the fortifications, especially around the damaged section of the castle, because everyone understood that if the town itself could not be held, the citadel would have to become the last place of refuge. But when the Mongols came suddenly, there was no orderly defence of the outer city. The sense of danger was too immediate, the pressure too intense. Some fled at once. Others hid. The invaders entered quickly, burned much of the city, and stripped it of anything worth taking. Then came the killing. Men and women, the wealthy and the poor, townspeople and nobles alike were cut down wherever they were found. Streets, houses, fields, and alleys became places of slaughter. No distinction was made between age, rank, or sex. Once the looting and killing were done, the attackers withdrew a short distance and encamped out of sight, leaving behind the impression that they might have abandoned the siege. That pause proved fatal. The defenders in the castle convinced themselves that the depth of the moat, the towers on the walls, and the number of armed men inside had discouraged the enemy. Scouts sometimes saw Mongol riders near the fortress, but Hungarian horsemen chased them off and took that as further proof that the attackers were hesitant. As the days passed without a full assault, confidence returned. People began leaving the safety of the citadel and moving back into houses that still stood outside the castle walls. It was exactly what the Mongols wanted. At dawn one day, they came back without warning. They struck the people outside before they could organize or retreat, killing most of them on the spot. Then they moved immediately against the fortification itself. 7 siege engines were set up opposite the newly repaired wall, and a steady bombardment of stones began. Day and night, the attacks continued. The wall that had seemed so necessary and reassuring collapsed under the pressure. Once the defences were broken, the castle was stormed. The remaining soldiers, clergy, and civilians were seized if they were not killed in the assault itself. Inside the sacred buildings, terror reached another level. Women of noble birth, young girls, and others sought refuge in the cathedral, hoping that holy ground might shield them. It did not. The soldiers were forced to hand over their weapons, while churchmen were tortured until they gave up everything they owned. The attackers could not easily force entry into the cathedral at first, so they set it on fire, burning the building together with the women and everything inside. In other churches, the crimes were so appalling that even later witnesses struggled to describe them. Afterward, nobles, townsmen, soldiers, and clergy were led out and beheaded in the open. Tombs were desecrated. Holy objects were smashed, trampled, or stolen. Altars were violated. Churches became places not of sanctuary, but of humiliation, violence, and death. Even after the city had been emptied and the corpses began to rot in the streets, the horror did not end. People who had hidden in nearby woods returned cautiously, hoping to search for food among the ruins. Again, the Mongols appeared without warning and killed whoever they found. This cycle repeated itself again and again. It was not enough to destroy the city once. The destruction had to be prolonged until not a single living soul remained to reclaim it. Only then did the invaders finally leave. A different window into the Mongol world appears in the account of a Western friar who travelled east and reached the camp of Batu. His journey did not begin as a grand diplomatic mission in his own eyes. He saw himself as a religious envoy, a preacher moving among unbelievers, carrying a message rather than negotiating a treaty. Yet the Mongol rulers saw matters differently. From the moment he entered their sphere, he was treated not simply as a wandering holy man, but as a figure connected to kings, courts, and international politics. Batu in particular wanted to know who had sent him, why he had come, and whether his words concealed a larger political purpose. The friar's route brought him to the Volga, where a new settlement had grown around, the traffic moving to and from Batu's court. The place was populated by a mixture of peoples and functioned almost like a gateway, handling travellers, envoys, and communication. Already this reveals something essential about Mongol power. Their authority was not only military, it created routes, administrative nodes, and organised spaces where different peoples were drawn together under the needs of empire. From there, he was carried downstream by boat toward Batu's encampment. Along the way, he observed the vastness of the landscape and the strange distribution of peoples across it. He noted Muslim communities in regions that seemed remote and difficult to reach, and he was struck by how firmly some of them held to their faith even in places that seemed far removed from the centres of Islamic learning. His reaction mixed surprise with disapproval, but it also shows that the territories controlled by the Mongols were already zones of intense movement and cultural contact, not empty frontiers. Nothing impressed him more, however, than the camp of Batu itself. When he first saw it, it appeared less like a camp than a moving city stretched across the plain. The ruler's own residence stood at the centre, while the tents, wagons, and households of his followers spread outward for miles. The arrangement was not random. Every group knew where to place itself in relation to the ruler's dwelling, and the entire encampment was organised according to an understood order. That order mattered. It embodied the structure of power. Batu's residence was the fixed centre around which all others were arranged. The camp itself became a map of authority. The friar was first brought to a Muslim official who treated him poorly and offered no food. This detail is important because it shows how access to the ruler was controlled by intermediaries, many of whom used their position to intimidate, delay, or extract advantage. The next day, he was taken to the court itself. Since Batu's own residence could not contain the crowd assembled there, a great pavilion had been set up. Before entering, he and his companions were warned about the rules that governed the space. They were not to speak unless asked. They were not to touch the ropes of the tent, which were treated as a kind of sacred threshold. They had to move carefully, obey instructions exactly, and remain aware that even the smallest gesture might be judged. These repeated references to bodily posture are among the most revealing parts of the account. Feet, knees, hands, head, face, and even the way a man sat were all loaded with meaning. The friar notes that he stood barefoot, wearing his religious garments but bareheaded, knowing that his appearance itself would be read as a sign. When brought inside, he was not at first required to kneel in the formal way expected of ambassadors. But once he began speaking, Batu signalled that he should go lower, onto both knees. He obeyed, not because he accepted Mongol claims as legitimate in a spiritual sense, but because he understood that this court operated through visible signs of subordination. The body had to show respect before words could be heard. That is why postures and gestures appear again and again in the narrative. At Batu's court, power was staged physically. One's place in the tent, whether one stood or knelt, whether one touched a threshold, raised one's face, bowed the head, or leaned on the hand, all could be interpreted. A lowered head might be read as sadness or disrespect. A certain way of sitting could be seen as ominous. The body became part of the language of authority. To enter the ruler's presence was not merely to speak, it was to perform obedience within a carefully controlled ceremonial world. The friar also paid close attention to Batu himself. The ruler sat on an elevated throne covered in gold, approached by steps, with one of his wives beside him. Men sat on one side, women on the other, and luxury vessels filled the entrance. The arrangement was richly symbolic. It projected wealth, hierarchy, and confidence. Batu looked at visitors sharply and silently, examining them before they were allowed to say anything. His control of the scene was total. Even the offer of drink became part of the ritual, since sharing fermented mare's milk with him signalled admission into his presence, however briefly. As for Batu's concerns, they centred on identity, allegiance, and intent. He wanted to know whether the King of France had sent envoys before, who this friar truly represented, and whether he came as part of some larger political strategy. The friar tried to insist that he had come because he had heard that Batu's son was Christian and that his own purpose was religious, rather than diplomatic. But Batu did not simply accept that explanation. He had names recorded, asked about wars in the West, and listened closely for signs that this mission was connected to conflict with the Muslims. In other words, Batu viewed foreign visitors through the lens of imperial intelligence. He wanted to understand the political world beyond his frontier and to place every traveller within it. The friar's own behaviour before Batu stands in sharp contrast to the conduct of some earlier missionaries who entered pagan lands with a far more confrontational approach. He did speak boldly and told Batu plainly that salvation required baptism and Christian belief. Yet he combined that message with caution. He did not refuse the demanded gestures. He did not deliberately provoke a fatal confrontation. He adapted enough to remain in conversation, even while preserving the essentials of his preaching. His courage was real, but so was his calculation. This was not the behaviour of a man walking toward martyrdom with open defiance. It was the conduct of someone trying to survive long enough to speak at all. Another Western observer approached the Mongol world from a more political and practical angle. Travelling through the lands of Ruses and Ukraine, he encountered a region transformed by conquest. In his account, the steppe lands are no longer a distant frontier, but a zone where the power of the Khan reaches through local commanders, tribute demands, safe conducts, escorts, and intimidation. These territories are marked above all by insecurity. Roads are dangerous. Whole districts have been depopulated. Lithuanians raid where Rus's communities have been weakened beyond resistance. The destruction wrought by the Mongols has left such deep wounds that secondary threats now flourish in its wake. He first learned much from a Rus's prince who had direct knowledge of how relations with the Mongols now worked. Envoys had gone to Batu and returned with safe conducts. That alone shows how the Khan's authority was becoming embedded in local politics. Princes who wished to preserve their position had to communicate with Mongol rulers, secure written permission, and acknowledge the practical necessity of dealing with them. The traveller understood from this that anyone trying to conduct business among the Mongols needed proper recognition, gifts, and the willingness to submit to their administrative expectations. As he moved eastward, He also noticed that Mongol rule in the region did not appear only through the distant name of Batu. It was exercised through local officials, military commanders, prefects, escorts, and intermediaries. In Kiev, for example, he had to deal with a commander in charge of 1,000 men and with other local nobles before even determining how to proceed. These men advised him, helped arrange transport, and extracted presents. In the towns farther on, other officials controlled movement, provided horses, and demanded recognition of their status. Power was fragmented in daily practice but unified in allegiance. Each local man acted as a gatekeeper of the Khan's order. The condition of the land itself was grim. Travel took place through deep snow, exposed roads, and half-ruined zones where political authority existed, but ordinary life had been badly damaged. He speaks of the men of Ruses as too reduced by killing and captivity to defend themselves against raiders. That tells us a great deal about the situation in the steppe borderlands. Mongol conquest had not simply added a new ruling layer. It had broken older balances of power so thoroughly that local communities could no longer guarantee their own security. Yet this observer, unlike the friar who described the Mongols as ridiculous, arrogant, and almost absurd in their customs, portrays the local rulers in a more practical and often harsher way. He does not mock them as fools. Instead, he presents them as crafty, greedy, manipulative, and fully capable of abusing their office. One local Alan official in particular is described as malicious and deceitful, inventing false claims in order to draw the travellers to him and extort more gifts. Even after receiving what was first offered, he demanded more, rejected the presents as insufficient, and squeezed out further concessions. This is not the portrait of a foolish barbarian. It is the portrait of a functioning opportunist within a system of conquest. That difference matters. Where one traveller tries to diminish Mongol prestige by emphasizing foreign strangeness and arrogance, the other stresses the practical reality of domination. The men he meets are dangerous because they are effective in their own way. They understand leverage, control routes, and know how to force compliance from anyone who passes through their sphere. Their authority may be local, but it rests on the shadow of the Khan and the fear attached to Mongol power. Taken together, these accounts reveal three closely connected dimensions of the Mongol world in Europe and Eurasia. First comes destruction, as seen in Oradea, where siege, warfare, deception, repeated return attacks, and the deliberate extermination of survivors show that conquest was meant to terrify as well as defeat. Second comes ceremonial power, as seen in Batu's camp, where rank, spatial order, bodily ritual, and visual magnificence transformed the ruler's encampment into a moving capital. Third comes administrative reach, visible in the steppe lands of Rus, where local commanders, escorts, prefects, and safe conducts extended Mongol authority into everyday movement and diplomacy. None of these worlds was separate from the others. The same power that could burn a cathedral and slaughter those within it could also receive envoys in gold-covered pavilions and question them with calm precision. The same empire that shattered cities could organize immense camps with orderly placement and regulate the routes of ambassadors through local officials across frozen plains. That combination of terror, ceremony, and control was part of what made the Mongols so formidable. They were not only destroyers, they were masters of movement, intimidation, and political display. For those who faced them, this produced a strange and unsettling experience. One moment, a city could believe itself safe behind walls, only to discover it had been deceived. Another moment, a missionary could find himself kneeling before a ruler in a tent more impressive than many capitals. A traveller might pass through lands emptied by massacre, yet still encounter highly structured chains of command operating in the name of a distant Khan. That was the reality of the Mongol age in Eastern Europe and the steppe, a world where devastation and order advance together.